The snow had been falling for 3 hours when Harlan Creed rode up to the Boone property line and made his decision. He didn't knock. Men like Harlan never knocked. He simply dismounted, walked to the fence post marking the eastern boundary of Silas Boone's land, and ripped the deed notice from the wood with one gloved hand. Then he pulled out a match, cupped it against the wind, and watched the paper catch. 48 hours, he said to nobody. His foreman stood 6 feet behind him, hat low, saying nothing. Tell Boone he's got 48 hours before I bring the law out here and drag his boys into the cold myself. The foreman nodded. And the woman? Harlan's jaw tightened, especially the woman. He dropped the burning paper into the snow, turned his horse, and rode back toward town without once looking at the dark cabin windows where 3 small faces had been watching the whole time. If this story already has your heart pounding, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a single story, because the ones coming next will shake you even harder. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Kote. The first thing Silas Boone noticed about that Christmas Eve was the silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence a man earns after a long day of work. When the barn is locked, the fire is banked, and the world outside agrees to leave him alone for a few hours. This was the other kind. The kind that sits on your chest. The kind that reminds you of every chair at the table that used to be full. He was standing at the kitchen window with a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching the snow come down in thick, slow curtains across the yard. The lantern above the barn door swung on its hook. The fence posts had disappeared under white. The trail that connected his land to the main road had been swallowed entirely, and somewhere out beyond all of it, the mountains sat invisible behind clouds that had been pressing lower since noon. 3 years. That was how long the ranch had been running on the particular brand of grief that doesn't announce itself every morning, but simply waits behind every ordinary task. Behind the mending of saddles and the counting of cattle and the peeling of potatoes for supper. 3 years since Margaret had died of fever in the middle of July, which Silas had always considered a cruel time to lose someone because at least in winter a man had the cold to blame for his hollow feeling. He heard Finn before he saw him. The boy's feet on the stairs were unmistakable, 7 years old and already convinced that the floor existed specifically to be stomped on. Papa. Finn appeared in the doorway wearing 2 different socks and a shirt that had been buttoned wrong by 3 holes. Owen says we're not getting presents this year because you forgot. I didn't forget. He says you forgot. Owen doesn't know what he's talking about. That's what I told him. Finn climbed onto the chair nearest the stove and sat with his chin in both hands, watching his father with the unnerving directness that only the very young and the very old seem capable of. He also says Christmas is stupid now. Owen says a lot of things. He cried yesterday, in the barn. He didn't think I saw, but I did. Silas set the cold coffee down. Why don't you go tell your brother's supper will be ready in an hour? It smells like burnt beans. Go. Finn slid off the chair and disappeared back up the stairs with the same theatrical stomping, and Silas returned to the window. The snow was coming harder now. He could hear it in the way the wind had shifted, pushing the flakes sideways against the glass instead of letting them fall clean. He was thinking about whether the east pasture fence had been properly reinforced before the storm hit when he heard Owen's voice from upstairs, sharp and indignant, followed by the muffled thud of something being thrown, followed by Wyatt's voice cutting through both of them with the particular authority of a 13-year-old who has decided he is essentially an adult. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. He did not consider himself a bad father. He considered himself an exhausted one, which he understood was not the same thing, but in the worst hours felt identical. He cooked meals. He made sure the boys got to the schoolhouse in town when the weather allowed. He checked their boots for holes and their faces for fevers and their homework for errors. He did all of the things a man was supposed to do, and he did them with the steady mechanical competence of someone who has decided that forward motion is the only acceptable substitute for actual living. But he didn't know how to give them Christmas. Not this year. Not without Margaret, who had known exactly how to make the cabin smell like pine and cinnamon and something warm that he had never been able to identify and had never thought to ask about while she was alive. He was still at the window when the knock came. Not a polite knock, Not the measured, apologetic rap of a neighbor who knows he might be inconveniencing someone. This was the sound of a fist hitting wood with everything it had left. 3 hard blows that rattled the door in its frame and sent Silas spinning away from the window with one hand already reaching for the rifle above the mantel. "Papa!" Finn's voice came shooting down the stairs. "Someone's at the door." "I heard it. Stay up there." He crossed the room with the rifle in one hand and unlatched the door with the other and pulled it open against the wind's resistance, and a woman nearly fell through it. She caught herself on the doorframe, barely. Her fingers wrapped around the wood with a grip that looked like the only grip she had left in her, and she straightened up with what Silas recognized immediately as the kind of pride that persists even when the body has given up every argument for it. She was maybe 30, maybe a little younger. It was hard to tell under the ice and the exhaustion. Her coat was not adequate for this weather. A city coat, something meant for cold that stayed civilized, not the particular violence of a Wyoming blizzard. Her boots were soaked through. The scarf around her head had frozen at the edges. Her face was very pale, and her lips had gone a color that made Silas tighten his grip on the rifle before lowering it. She was holding a wooden chest against her body with both arms. Small, maybe 15 inches long, dark-stained walnut with iron hinges, pressed against her ribs like she was holding a wound closed. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steadier than her legs. "I wasn't going to knock. I was going to keep going, but my horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I've been walking, and I can't—" She stopped, took a breath. "I'm not asking to stay. I just need to warm up enough to keep moving." "Where are you trying to get to?" "Caldwell Station." Silas stared at her. "Caldwell Station is 11 miles west of here." "I know. In this storm, in the dark, with no horse." "I know," she said again. "I just need an hour." From the top of the stairs came Finn's voice, no longer willing to be contained by the suggestion of staying upstairs. "Papa, who is it? Is she hurt? She looks cold. Papa, she looks really cold." The woman glanced up at the sound of the boy's voice, and something moved across her face. Not weakness exactly, something older than weakness. Silas stepped back from the door. "Come in." She didn't argue. She came through the door and he pushed it shut against the wind, and immediately the warmth of the cabin surrounded her and he watched her close her eyes for just a second. Not dramatically, not with gratitude displayed for an audience. Just the involuntary response of a body that has been too cold for too long and has suddenly encountered heat. Finn was halfway down the stairs. Owen appeared behind him, then Wyatt at the very top, one hand on the rail, watching with the careful wariness of a boy who has learned that new things often come with complications. "Finn, put some more wood on the fire," Silas said. "Owen, get the kettle." "Who is she?" Owen asked. "Someone who needs to warm up. Move." Finn moved immediately, delighted by the drama of it. Owen hesitated, then moved. Wyatt remained at the top of the stairs. The woman had not moved far from the door. She stood in the small entry space between the door and the kitchen, still holding the wooden chest, still standing with that posture that said she was not planning to take up any more room than absolutely necessary. "Sit down," Silas said, pulling a chair close to the fire. "I'm fine standing." "You're dripping on my floor and your hands are shaking. Sit down." She sat. Not gratefully and not resentfully. She sat the way someone sits when they've made the practical calculation that their legs are about to stop cooperating regardless of what they decide. She kept the chest on her lap. Silas hung the rifle back above the mantel and turned to look at her properly. Up close, the exhaustion was more evident. There was a cut along her jaw, mostly healed but recent enough that it had left a thin red line, and her right wrist had a bruise showing above the edge of her cuff. Not from the cold. He'd seen enough bruises in his life to know the difference between what weather does and what people do. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eliza. Eliza Rowan." "Silas Boone." He nodded toward the boys. "That's Finn. Owen's the one at the kettle pretending he's not listening to us. And Wyatt's—" He glanced at the stairs. Wyatt had come down 3 steps. "Wyatt's somewhere in between." Eliza looked at the boys with an expression Silas couldn't quite read. Not pity, not the saccharine warmth strangers sometimes aimed at children. Something quieter than that. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. You're only staying an hour." "Yes," she said. "An hour." Finn appeared with a log twice the size of what the fire actually needed and fed it in with tremendous satisfaction while Owen brought a cup of something hot and set it on the table beside her with excessive care, the way a boy does when he's pretending he isn't interested in the person he's serving. Eliza wrapped both hands around the cup, and some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders. "What's in the box?" Finn asked. "Finn." Silas's voice was flat. "It's just a question." "It's not your question to ask." Eliza glanced down at the chest in her lap. "Things I couldn't bear to lose," she said, and her voice didn't change when she said it, which somehow made it worse. Wyatt had come all the way down the stairs now. He stood with his arms crossed at the bottom, his father's posture in miniature, studying Eliza with the particular intensity of a child who has appointed himself his family's first line of defense. "Where'd you come from?" Wyatt asked. "Wyoming." "We're in Wyoming. East of here, near Archer Creek." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. "There was a fire near Archer Creek last spring." A pause so small most people would have missed it. "Yes. Our teacher told us about it, said a whole settlement burned." "Wyatt," Silas said, "I'm just saying what she told us." Eliza looked at the older boy steadily. "Your teacher was right." The fire popped. Outside, the wind had climbed another register, pressing itself against every seam and crack in the cabin walls, with the persistence of something that meant to get in, eventually, no matter how long it took. Silas went to the window and looked out and felt the specific category of dread that comes from understanding that the situation you thought was temporary has just been reclassified. The snow on the yard was past the second fence rail. The barn door was barely visible. The trail was gone so completely it might as well have never existed. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Miss," she said quietly, "or just Eliza." "Eliza, you're not going anywhere tonight." A pause. "I can make do in the barn." "You can't make do in the barn." "No one can make do in that barn tonight. We've got a spare room off the back. It's not much, but it's got a bed and walls." He turned away from the window and looked at her. "In the morning, we'll see where the storm leaves us." He expected an argument. She looked like someone who might give one on principle. Instead, she looked down at the chest for a moment, then back up at him. "All right," she said. Finn pumped his fist. Owen spun back toward the stove with exaggerated casualness. Wyatt said nothing, which was a thing Silas had learned to watch more carefully than his younger son's noise. The supper, burned beans, as Finn had accurately predicted, plus the remainder of a salted ham Silas had been rationing for the week, was eaten in the particular silence of people who are each trying to take each other's measure without appearing to do so. Eliza ate without complaint and without excess. She answered the boys' questions with a directness that seemed to catch them slightly off balance, because most adults either deflected their questions or over-answered them, and Eliza did neither. "Do you have kids?" Owen asked through a mouthful of cornbread. "Owen," Silas said. "It's all right," Eliza said. She looked at Owen steadily. "I did. A daughter. She was 4. Owen absorbed this with the directness of a 10-year-old who hasn't yet learned to flinch from difficult facts. "What happened to her?" "The fire," Eliza said. "The one near Archer Creek." The table went quiet. Even Finn, who had been drawing invisible designs on the tablecloth with one finger, stopped moving. "I'm sorry," Owen said with surprising sincerity. "Thank you," Eliza said. Wyatt looked at his father. Silas looked at his plate. After supper, Silas showed Eliza to the small room at the back of the cabin, an afterthought of a room, built in the second year when he'd briefly hoped his brother might come out from Missouri. A cot with a wool blanket, a small window that needed better sealing around the frame, and a nail on the wall where someone had once hung a mirror that wasn't there anymore. "It's fine," she said, before he could apologize for it. "There's another blanket in the chest at the end of the cot." "Thank you." He was almost out the door when she spoke again. "Mr. Boone." He stopped. "I won't cause you any trouble," she said. "I want you to know that. I know you don't know me, and I know taking in a stranger." She stopped. "I won't be any trouble." He looked at her for a moment. "Get some sleep," he said. I went back to the main room and stood at the window again for a long time, watching the snow pile up against everything he owned, and thought about Margaret, and about the 3 boys sleeping above his head, and about the particular turn a Christmas Eve will sometimes take when you have stopped expecting anything from it. He didn't sleep well. He was up before the sun, which in December meant he was up in absolute darkness, and he was dressed and pulling on his coat when he heard movement in the kitchen and stopped in the doorway to find Eliza already at the stove. She had the fire going, the kettle on, and was sorting through the pantry with the systematic efficiency of someone who has been feeding people on limited resources for long enough that it no longer requires thought. "I found the oats," she said without turning around. "Is there anything wrong with using them?" "No." "Your cornmeal barrel is getting low." "I know. I can stretch it." She was quiet for a moment, moving things around the shelves. "You've got enough to feed everyone for 4 or 5 days if you're careful. Maybe 6. Depends on the storm." Silas poured himself coffee from the kettle she'd already filled and stood against the wall. "You cook a lot for other people?" "For a while, yes." She turned around and looked at him. She'd slept clearly, though not as much as she needed. The cut along her jaw was cleaner in the daylight, the bruise on her wrist more visible. "I ran a meal service for 2 years in Archer Creek, before the fire." "That's honest work." "It was." She turned back to the oats. "I'm sorry for imposing. I'll be out of your way as soon as the storm lets up." "You said that." "I mean it. I know you mean it." He drank his coffee and watched her work for a moment, and then went out to check the animals before the boys woke up. The cold hit him like a physical blow stepping out of the cabin. Not the honest cold of a normal December morning, but the other kind, the kind that had malice in it, pressing in from every direction with the specific intention of finding every gap between a man's scarf and his collar, his gloves and his sleeve. The snow was past his knees in the yard. The barn doors had frozen shut, and he had to break the ice from the hinges with a piece of firewood before he could get them open. Inside, the horses were restless, and the cattle were pressed together in the far corner with the group mind distress of animals that know something is wrong but can't articulate what. He worked through it. He always worked through it. That was the one thing he had never lost. Not to grief, not to exhaustion, not to 3 winters of doing it all alone. He was spreading fresh hay when he heard the barn door and looked up to find Eliza in the doorway, in her inadequate coat, carrying a bucket. "I can do that," he said. "I know." She came in anyway and crossed to the water trough and began breaking the surface ice with the efficiency of long practice. "Which ones need extra feed?" He stared at her. "You know livestock." "My father raised horses before we came west." "Where'd you come from originally?" "Ohio." She was working without looking at him. "A long time ago." He watched her for another moment. Then he went back to the hay. They worked in silence for a while, the animals settling around them, the storm pressing its weight against the barn roof in long, slow surges that sent small falls of dust down from the rafters. It wasn't a comfortable silence exactly, but it wasn't uncomfortable either. It was the silence of 2 people engaged in the same necessary task, which is its own category of human contact. "The chest," Silas said eventually. He hadn't planned to say it. She didn't stop working. "What about it?" "You carried it 2 miles in a blizzard on foot." "Yes." "It must matter quite a bit." "It's all I have left," she said simply. He didn't ask anything else. They were back inside, and breakfast was on the table, and Finn was already eating before Wyatt came downstairs and stopped dead on the bottom step, staring at Eliza at the stove. "She's still here," he said. "Storm's still going," Silas said. "Eat your breakfast." "How long is she staying?" "Wyatt." "It's a fair question, Papa." But he sat down and ate, and Silas noticed that he ate everything on his plate, which was more than he'd been doing lately. The storm did not let up by noon. It did not let up by mid-afternoon either, and by the time the winter light began its early fade, it was clear that what had started as a bad storm had organized itself into something that intended to stay. Eliza did not ask for things to do. She found them. While Silas repaired a broken harness fitting he'd been putting off for 2 weeks, she cleaned the kitchen more thoroughly than it had been cleaned since Margaret, fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door that had been sticking since September, and darned 3 pairs of the boys' socks using thread from a small kit she produced from her coat pocket. Owen watched her darn the socks with the fascinated concentration of someone watching a magic trick. "How do you do that?" he asked. "I'll show you if you want." He wanted, though he wasn't about to say so. She showed him anyway, talking him through it in the same practical, unembellished way she seemed to approach everything, and Owen by the end of the afternoon could produce a serviceable darn with only 3 attempts, which he announced to nobody in particular with the satisfaction of a boy who has learned something real. Finn had attached himself to her orbit with the irresistible gravitational pull of a 7-year-old who has decided someone is interesting and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He told her approximately everything about the ranch. The names of all the horses, the history of every scar on the barn wall, the complicated social politics of the cattle herd, and the location of what he described as a secret tunnel under the east pasture that Silas was fairly certain did not exist. Eliza listened to all of it with apparent attention. "Do you believe me about the tunnel?" Finn asked. "I believe you believe it's there," she said. Finn considered this for a moment. "That's a very careful answer." "I'm a careful person." "Papa says careful is good, but too careful means you're scared." Eliza glanced over at Silas, who was very deliberately focused on the harness. "Your papa sounds like he's had some experience with that." Finn, delighted by the implication that adults could be wrong about things, pressed on with 17 additional questions, which Eliza answered with a consistency and patience that Silas found himself watching from the corner of his eye more than was strictly necessary. Evening came. Supper was better than the night before. Eliza had worked something out of the pantry contents that involved the ham and the remaining beans, and something she'd found dried at the back of a shelf that Silas hadn't noticed in months. And the result was warm enough and filling enough that Owen asked for a second bowl, which was the first time in a while. After supper, Finn produced from somewhere the battered deck of cards that usually lived under the bench by the door, and there was some kind of game played on the kitchen table that involved rules Silas couldn't follow, and apparently neither could anyone else, which seemed to be the point. He watched them from across the room. Finn was trying to cheat with transparent enthusiasm. Owen was cataloging the rules violations with precise indignation. Wyatt was participating with the guarded semi-enjoyment of a teenager who has decided to pretend he is above the activity while clearly not being above the activity. And Eliza was laughing. It was not a performance of laughter, not the polite, carefully measured kind adults deploy around children to indicate that they are being charmed. It was the real thing, brief, unguarded, breaking through when Finn's attempted deception was particularly audacious, gone before it could be examined. Silas had not heard a woman laugh in that kitchen in 3 years. He had to look away. He went to the window again. The storm. Always the storm to look at. The snow reflected a faint light back that gave the dark yard an almost luminous quality, and in the glass he could see, faintly, the reflection of the table behind him, the fire, the 4 figures hunched over the cards, and he felt something he had been very carefully not feeling for 3 years begin to move around behind his ribs, in a way that made him press his hand flat against the cold glass. He heard the chair scrape, heard Eliza's voice telling the boys it was time for bed, and their protests, Finn's theatrical, Owen's logical, Wyatt's single syllable that carried everything. And then Silas turned around and saw Wyatt looking not at Eliza, but at him, and the expression on the boy's face was something that would take Silas a long time to be able to name. "Bed," Silas said. They went. Eventually. The cabin settled into its nighttime sounds, the fire, the wind, the snow against the glass. Eliza carried the wooden chest to the back room, and Silas sat by the fire with the same cold coffee he'd been failing to drink for 2 hours and looked at the ceiling and tried to organize his thoughts into something sensible. She would leave when the storm cleared. She had a destination. She had reasons for it. Whatever was in that chest was hers, and whatever her plans were hers. And he had been foolish enough once to think that opening the door to something you hadn't been expecting was the same as inviting it to stay. But he could still hear Finn's laughter from upstairs where the boy was probably still awake despite being told to sleep. And he could remember Owen's face over the darning lesson, and he could hear Wyatt's voice in the barn that morning, and he pressed his knuckles against his mouth and sat with all of it for a long time. He didn't know then. He didn't allow himself to know. But somewhere under the snow, something that had been frozen for 3 years had detected a change in temperature and begun, very quietly, to consider the possibility of spring. The morning of December 26th brought news that changed everything. It was Silas who heard it first. The sound of a horse in the yard despite the snow, the particular urgency of a rider who has pushed an animal too hard. He was out the door before the knock, and found his nearest neighbor, Cal Hutchins, in the yard, his horse blowing steam and Cal's face wearing an expression Silas had seen on men who had crossed from worry into something beyond it. Silas. Cal pulled off one glove and pressed it back on. Bad news. The Henderson family snowed in on the North Ridge. Their chimney went. Fire caught the roof last night. They got out, 6 of them, but they've got nothing. They made it to the Farley place, but the Farleys are barely keeping their own heads above water. How many families in trouble? Cal looked at the ground. Counting the Hendersons? I've ridden past 4 homesteads this morning that won't make it through another week of this on their own. Silas stood in the snow in his coat, without his hat, and felt the weight of it. Counting you? Cal asked. We're all right. Silas looked back at the cabin. We've got room. Silas, you can't. Tell the Henderson family to come. Tell the others. He was already turning toward the door. I'm not going to stand here and count beds while children are cold. Cal looked at him for a moment with an expression that mixed admiration with concern in equal measure. That woman you've got in there, he said carefully. Silas stopped. What about her? Mabel saw her come in off the storm 2 nights ago. People are asking. People can come ask me themselves. They're saying she might be... Goodbye, Cal. Silas went back inside. Eliza was at the window. She had heard enough. How many people? She asked. I don't know yet. He was pulling on his coat properly this time, reaching for his hat. We need to look at what we've got in the barn. Whatever we're running short on, we need to know now. She nodded. I'll start on the pantry. He looked at her. This isn't your problem. No, she agreed. But I'm here. She picked up the lantern from the table and went to the pantry, and Silas stood in the middle of his kitchen for a moment, staring at the space she'd just occupied, and then went to get more firewood. The Henderson family arrived by mid-afternoon. 6 people, the parents hollow-eyed, and the 4 children in 2 small coats with the careful silence of children who have seen their house burn and are still processing what that means. The youngest was barely 3, carried in her father's arms, asleep despite everything. Finn met them at the door. You can have my bed, he told the 3-year-old's father, with complete seriousness. I'll sleep by the fire. I like the fire. Eliza, behind him, put one hand briefly on top of Finn's head. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. By nightfall, there were 14 people in the Boone cabin and barn, and Eliza was running the kitchen with the quiet authority of someone who has managed large-scale meals under difficult conditions and knows exactly where the inefficiencies are. She had Owen keeping track of the stores, Wyatt organizing the barn space, and had somehow communicated to the Henderson mother, a woman named Ruth, who kept apologizing for things that weren't her fault, that the best way she could help was to tell Eliza exactly what each of her children would and wouldn't eat. Silas watched all of it from the edges. He watched Eliza manage the chaos without managing to look like she was managing it. Watched the Henderson children gradually stop being silent. Watched Ruth Henderson, 40 minutes into being in the cabin, start actually talking to Eliza instead of apologizing to her, their voices going low and serious in the way women's voices do when they have stopped being polite and started being honest. He watched Wyatt, across the room, watching Eliza too. And for the first time since she'd arrived, what he saw on his oldest son's face wasn't wariness. It was something he would have to think about. The wooden chest sat on the shelf in Eliza's room where she had placed it that first night, and it did not open, and no one asked about it, and somehow its presence in the house felt heavier with each passing day, the way unasked questions always do. On the evening of December 27th, long after the children were asleep and the Henderson family had settled and the fire had burned to coals, Silas found Eliza sitting alone on the porch steps despite the cold, her breath making white clouds in the air. He sat down next to her without asking if she wanted company. They were quiet for a while. The storm's turning, she said. He looked at the sky. She was right. The clouds had a different texture, and the wind had changed direction slightly. Another day? Maybe 2. Then I'll go. He was quiet. I've imposed... You haven't, he said. Mr. Boone. Silas. Silas. She looked at her hands. They were chapped from work, the knuckles red. I have to get to Caldwell Station. I have a cousin there who might... She stopped. It's a plan, anyway. Might, he said. Might, she admitted. He looked out at the snow-covered yard. My wife died in July, he said, 3 years ago. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. Most people said they were sorry, and most of the time it arrived in the conversation like furniture in a doorway, an obstruction everyone had to politely navigate around. "The boys remember her," she said instead. "Wyatt does. Owen's getting fuzzy around the edges on some things. And Finn," he stopped. Finn was 4. He's got the smell of her perfume and the sound of her voice, and that's about it. That's not nothing. No, it's not nothing. He looked at the sky again. He sleeps with her old shawl. Eliza was quiet. Then, "Your youngest said she used to tell stories at night. Every night, made them up. The boys had favorites, and she'd do the same ones on request." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I tried a few times after. I'm not good at it." "Nobody's born knowing how," she said. He looked at her. "Did you tell your daughter stories?" The pause was barely there. "Every night," she said. "Hers were about a bear who wanted to be a sailor, very specific." He almost smiled. He felt it arrive in his face and didn't stop it. A bear. She was very specific about what the bear wanted. It had to be a fishing boat, not a sailing ship. She was 4 years old and already very precise. He did smile then. It didn't feel like a betrayal. It just felt like a smile, which was something he hadn't expected. They sat in the cold for a while longer, not saying much, just sitting. And when Eliza finally went inside and Silas stayed on the steps a little longer looking at the sky, he was thinking about a girl who was precise about the kind of boat a bear should sail on, and about his son who still slept with a shawl, and about the fact that grief was not the same thing as being alone, though for 3 years he had been treating them as identical. The storm had not finished with them yet, and neither, it was beginning to seem, had the winter. The storm broke on this morning of December 28th, not with any drama, but with the quiet exhaustion of something that had spent everything it had and simply stopped. Silas noticed it first by the sound, or rather, by the absence of it. The wind that had been pressing against the cabin walls for 4 straight days went still sometime before dawn, and the silence it left behind was so complete that he lay in his bunk for several minutes, just listening to it, adjusting to the texture of a world that had stopped trying to come through the walls. By the time he dressed and went to the window, the sky had turned the particular shade of pale gray that means a storm has genuinely moved on rather than paused to gather itself. The snow in the yard sat in drifts that came up past the lower fence rails, smooth and undisturbed, and the barn roof had a white ridge across it that would need to come down before it got any heavier. He was pulling on his second boot when he heard the kitchen already active below him. Eliza had been up for at least an hour. He could tell by the smell. Coffee properly made, not the half-hearted version he produced in the mornings when he was still half asleep, and something with cornmeal on the griddle that smelled like his mother's kitchen in a way that hit him low in the chest before he'd even reached the bottom stair. The Henderson children were already at the table, all 4 of them, ranging from the 3-year-old in a chair padded with a folded blanket up to the 12-year-old girl who had barely spoken since arriving, now sitting with her elbows on the table watching Eliza at the stove with an expression that was not quite comfort but was a clear step in that direction. Finn was also at the table, still in his nightshirt, apparently having decided that the niceties of dressing could wait until after breakfast. He was showing the 3-year-old Henderson girl. Her name was Bess, Silas had learned, though her family called her Button, a trick with 2 spoons that produced a clinking sound she found apparently hilarious. "You're not dressed," Silas said to Finn. "Breakfast first," Finn said, without looking up from the spoons. "That's not how mornings work." "It's how this morning works." Silas looked at Eliza's back, found no help there, and let it go. Ruth Henderson came in from the back room with the particular hollow-eyed efficiency of a woman who has been awake most of the night with a worried mind and has decided that motion is the answer. She looked at Eliza and Eliza looked at her, and something passed between them that Silas couldn't translate. Some communication conducted entirely in the frequency that women who have been through hard things together seem to develop naturally. "Storm's done," Silas said. Ruth nodded. "I saw." She picked up a cloth from the counter and started wiping down the already clean section of table near the wall. "We should be able to get back by tomorrow if the snow settles." "There's nothing to get back to," her husband Tom said from the doorway. He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse, just a fact that had to be stated out loud so it could be real. "We'll need to figure out the next thing." The kitchen went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Even Finn stopped with the spoons. "We'll figure it out," Eliza said, not turning from the stove. "But first, breakfast." It was not a profound statement. It was not even particularly comforting as statements go. But something about the certainty of it, the simple, unadorned practicality of it, cut through the quiet and let everyone in the room breathe again, and Tom Henderson nodded and came to the table and sat down, and that was that. Silas went out after breakfast to begin the work that 4 days of storm had accumulated. The drifts against the barn were shoulder high on the north side and would need digging out before the afternoon freeze set them harder. 2 sections of fence on the east pasture were down under the weight of the snow and would need temporary repair before the cattle found them. The water trough had frozen solid despite the insulation he'd packed around it before the storm, and the horses needed proper exercise after 4 days of close confinement. He had been at it for about an hour, working through the drift against the barn's north wall with a long-handled spade, when he heard the crunch of boots and looked up to find Wyatt coming across the yard with a second spade over his shoulder. "Your brothers are inside," Silas said. "Owen's helping Mrs. Rowan with the dishes. Finn's teaching Button to say horse words." Wyatt planted his spade into the base of the drift. "You need help." It wasn't a question. Silas didn't treat it like one. They worked side by side for a while, the kind of silence between a father and an oldest son that has layers to it. Not empty, not tense, just full of things that haven't found their way to words yet. The snow came off the wall in heavy shovelfuls, and their breath made white clouds, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses moved restlessly and then settled. "She's good at this," Wyatt said finally. Silas kept digging. "At what?" "At making things work when they shouldn't." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "The Hendersons came in here looking like they'd been through a mill, and by supper they looked almost normal. That's not nothing." "No." "Owen showed me the darn on his sock. It's better than what Mrs. Calloway does in town, and she does it for money." "Did you come out here to talk about sock darning?" Wyatt stopped shoveling and looked at his father. He had Margaret's directness in his face, her particular way of looking at a person that made pretending you hadn't heard the actual question somewhat difficult. "I came out to help," he said. "I'm also telling you what I noticed." "What did you notice?" "That she doesn't make a thing of it." Wyatt picked up his shovel again. "Doing things for people, I mean. She just does them, like it's not even a decision." Silas thought about Eliza at the barn water trough 2 days ago, breaking ice before he'd come out to do it himself. Thought about the way she'd taken over the kitchen without appearing to take it over. Thought about her sitting on the porch steps in the cold and saying things she hadn't needed to say. "She's been through something," Silas said. "I know." Wyatt was digging again, steady and efficient. "The fire." "More than the fire." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, and then, "The bruise on her wrist." Silas looked at his son. 13 years old, and he'd noticed. "You're observant." "Mama used to say the same thing." He said it flatly, not reaching for sentiment. "She said I noticed too much for my own comfort." "She was right." "She was right about most things." Wyatt cleared the corner of the barn wall and moved to the next section. "What happens when the snow settles?" "She goes to Caldwell Station, to her cousin." "That's what she said." Wyatt shoveled 2 more loads before he spoke again. "Do you think the cousin is actually there?" Silas had been thinking the same thing. He hadn't let himself think it directly, but it had been circling, the way Eliza had said might, the way she'd looked at her own hands when she said it. "I don't know." "What if she's not?" Silas leaned on his shovel and looked at the cleared wall for a moment. Then he picked it up again. "One problem at a time, Wyatt." Wyatt made a sound that was not quite a response. They kept digging. The problem with one problem at a time is that problems don't organize themselves by your preference. They arrive in clusters, the way bad weather does, the way debt does, the way loss does. One becomes 2 becomes something you can no longer count individually, but can only feel as a general weight. The rider came at noon. Silas was in the barn checking the horse's legs for stress from the long confinement when he heard the sound of hooves in the yard, and the particular quality of the approach, quick, purposeful, not the measured pace of a neighbor coming to check in, brought him to the barn door before the rider had dismounted. It was a man he didn't know well, Dale Pritchard, who worked as a hand for Harlan Creed's operation north of the valley. Mid-30s, broad across the shoulders, wearing Creed's brand colors on his coat, like a man who has decided his employer's identity is also his own. He didn't dismount. That told Silas something. "Mr. Boone," Pritchard touched his hat. "Mr. Creed sends his regards. Wanted you to know the road north is passable again by this afternoon. Good to know, Silas said. He waited. Pritchard looked at the cabin. Heard you had some company during the storm. Neighbors needed help. I helped. The Henderson family, sure. Pritchard's eyes came back to Silas, and there was something in them that was trying to look casual and not quite getting there. And a woman, traveling alone. People travel. Mr. Creed had some business near Archer Creek about 6 months back. Pritchard adjusted his gloves. He recognized the description when it came to him. Something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature moved through Silas's chest. He kept his face still. What description? Woman about 30, traveling with a wooden chest, moving west from Archer Creek. Pritchard shrugged, performing a casualness he didn't feel. He just wanted to mention that if that description matched your guest, there might be circumstances he'd want to discuss with her. Circumstances, Silas said. Legal ones. Property ones. Pritchard looked at the barn, then back. Mr. Creed is a reasonable man. Silas had heard Harlan Creed described several ways in his years in the valley. Reasonable was not one that had come up. Tell Mr. Creed I appreciate the road report. Pritchard sat on his horse for another moment, the way men do when they haven't delivered the actual message yet. Mr. Creed would appreciate a conversation with the woman, at her convenience. At her convenience, Silas repeated. Yes, sir. Well, Silas stepped back toward the barn. When it's convenient, I'm sure she'll let him know. Pritchard held for one more moment, reading Silas's face for whatever he could find there. Apparently he found what his employer would need to hear, because he pulled his horse around without further conversation and rode back out of the yard at the same purposeful pace he'd arrived. Silas stood in the barn door and watched him go. Owen appeared at his elbow. The boy had a gift for materializing without announcement that Silas had never quite figured out. Who was that? Creed's man. What did he want? To deliver a message. What message? Go tell Eliza I need to talk to her, Silas said. Owen went. Silas stayed in the barn door looking at the tracks Pritchard's horse had left in the snow, the trail of them leading back north toward the larger operation, toward the man who sent riders to check on strangers in other men's yards during a blizzard's aftermath. Eliza came out to the barn alone. She was wearing her coat, the inadequate one, and she'd wrapped a wool scarf around it that Silas recognized as one of Margaret's that had been hanging near the door. The sight of it hit him in an unguarded way, but he filed it away. She read his expression before he said a word. Harlan Creed, she said. It was not a question. Silas felt the cold deepen around him. You know him. I know of him. She came into the barn and let the door swing behind her. She stood with her arms crossed, not from coldness, but from something tighter. He had a land interest in Archer Creek, before the fire. What kind of interest? The kind that needed people to not be there anymore. She said it quietly, without drama, the way people say things they've had a long time to get to the flat side of. The settlement where I lived. It was on land he'd filed a disputed claim on. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously. Silas was quiet for a moment. He could hear one of the horses shifting in his stall, the slow sound of an animal at rest. You think he said it? I know he said it. She looked at him, and there was nothing uncertain in her eyes. I was there. I saw one of his hands on the south side of the settlement that night. I saw what he was carrying. Did you tell anyone? I told the county marshal. Her jaw tightened slightly. The county marshal works for Creed's money the same as everyone else within 50 miles of his operation. I was told I'd misremembered. Silas put his hand against the barn wall and looked at the ground. He was thinking about Pritchard in the yard, the casual performance of it, the message inside the message. Legal ones, property ones. What's in the chest, Eliza? She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Letters, she said finally. Documents, survey records from before Creed filed his claim, a signed witness statement from a man who saw the fire start and left the territory before anyone could silence him. She paused. And photographs. Of my husband. My daughter. Her voice stayed even. Those are just mine. The rest is what he wants. Silas straightened up. That's why you've been running. I haven't been running, she said, and there was something sharp in it. Not defensive, just precise. I've been moving toward something. There's a land attorney in Caldwell Station, a real one, not a county appointment. He's handled cases against operations like Creed's before. She looked at Silas steadily. The documents in that chest can reopen the investigation if they reach the right hands. Creed knows that. That's why he's been one step behind me since October. Silas thought about the bruise on her wrist, about the cut along her jaw, about the fact that her horse had thrown a shoe on the worst night of the winter, in a storm that would have been a death sentence without shelter. He thought about Wyatt's question. What if the cousin isn't there? Pritchard asked about you, he said, by description. I know. She looked at the chest, which she'd left inside, and he could see in her face the particular weight of a thing you've been carrying for so long. It stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like your own skeleton. I need to reach Caldwell Station. The road north won't be the only way he's watching. I know that too. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about nothing else since October. She looked at him. I'm sorry I brought this to your door, genuinely. You took in a stranger in good faith, and You didn't bring anything to my door that wasn't already here, Silas said. She stopped. Creed and I have history, he said. Not the Archer Creek kind, but he's been trying to acquire my water rights since before Margaret died. He makes offers. When the offers don't work, he sends men to make other kinds of offers. He looked at the yard through the barn door. I know what kind of reasonable he is. Eliza was very still. He'll come here. He may. If he connects you to me, he already has. Pritchard came to check. Silas looked at her. So let's talk about what comes next. She didn't collapse with relief. She didn't well up with gratitude. She looked at him with the focused attention of someone recalibrating their situation with new information, and then she nodded, once, the way a person nods when they've made a decision they're prepared to stand behind. All right, she said. They were in the cabin until almost dark. Silas and Eliza at the kitchen table with the boys put outside with instructions to check the east fence line, a job that would take them long enough. The Henderson family had moved to the back rooms, Tom and Ruth clearly understanding that what was happening at that table was not their business to witness. The documents from the chest were spread between them. Silas was not a lawyer and had never pretended to be, but he'd been running a ranch and handling his own land filings for 20 years, and he could read survey records. He could see what they showed. This line, he said, pointing to a marking on the oldest survey. This predates Creed's claim by 7 years. Yes. The settlement was established on land that was legally homesteaded. Creed's filing was fraudulent from the beginning. She traced the line with one finger. The attorney in Caldwell Station will be able to demonstrate that if he can see these. And the witness statement. Jedediah Cole. He was passing through on a trading route. He had no stake in it. He saw what he saw, and he wrote it down, and he signed it in front of 2 witnesses before he moved on to Oregon. She looked at the document. He might be dead for all I know, but the statement stands. Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the spread of papers. The problem is getting you to Caldwell Station with these before Creed makes a move. The road north is exactly where he'll be watching. Pritchard said it was passable, which means Creed already has people on it. He was quiet for a moment. There's a southern route, longer by 2 days, less traveled, especially in winter. I don't have a horse. You can take the gray mare, she's sure-footed in snow. Eliza looked at him across the documents. You'd loan me your horse. I'd do better than loan you a horse. He held her gaze. Wyatt's old enough to run things here for a few days. I'll ride with you. Silas, you're carrying evidence of arson and land fraud against a man who has already come to my property line once today. You're not doing that alone on a winter road. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of a man who has made a decision and is now simply informing people of it. We leave tomorrow morning early before his people will expect movement. She was quiet for a long time, looking at the table. Then, the boys, will be fine. Wyatt's been running things on bad days since he was 11. He paused. And the Hendersons are here. Tom Henderson has 4 children and a burned house and no resources. He's also got 2 working hands and a debt he'll feel. People in that situation don't leave a thing unfinished. Silas started gathering the documents back toward the chest. Let me talk to Tom tonight. She put her hand on his wrist, stopping the movement, not grasping, just stopping it. Her hand was very cold. I need you to understand what you're walking into, she said. If Creed decides you're helping me move these documents, he won't just try to buy your water rights anymore. Silas looked at her hand on his wrist, then at her face. I know Harlan Creed. Not the way I know him. No, he said. Not that way. He picked up the last document and placed it carefully in the chest. But I know what a burning barn looks like. I know what a knocked-over fence post looks like. I know what happens to people in this valley when they decide Creed's the kind of man you accommodate. He closed the lid. I decided something different a long time ago. I just hadn't had a reason to act on it. She took her hand back slowly. She looked at the closed chest for a moment. All right, she said for the second time that day. And this time it meant something different. Tom Henderson, when Silas spoke to him that evening by the back door with the cold coming in around the frame, was quiet for a long moment and then straightened up and said, You need us. We're here. He said it without bravado, without performance. Just the statement of a man who understands obligation and has decided to stand inside it. Wyatt was harder. Not because he argued. He didn't argue, which was in some ways more difficult. He listened to his father with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when Silas finished, he said, How long? 4 days. 5 at the outside. And if something happens? Then Cal Hutchins is 3 miles east. You know where his property is. Wyatt looked at the fire. Is it worth it? What she's carrying can put a man who burned a settlement away from the ability to do it again, Silas said. So yes. Wyatt was quiet for another minute. Then, she could have just told you all this from the beginning. She didn't know me from the beginning. She knows you now. Yes, Silas said. She does. Wyatt looked at his father with something in his expression that was old and young at the same time. The mixture that sits on a boy who has been carrying too much for his age and knows it and does it anyway. Bring her back safe, he said. Silas looked at his son for a moment. That's the plan. He didn't sleep much again that night, but it was a different kind of wakefulness than the nights before. Not the hollow, circling kind, but the kind that comes before action, when the mind is running the checklist of what needs doing and in what order. He lay in the dark thinking about the road south, about Creed's men and where they'd be positioned, about the gray mare's reliability in deep snow and whether the saddle pack would hold the weight of the chest plus 3 days of supplies. He was thinking about all of it very practically and efficiently, and only at the edge of sleep did the other things surface. Eliza's hand on his wrist, cold and certain, and the way she'd said all right the second time, as if she'd allowed herself to believe that one more thing was still possible. He pushed it down and let himself sleep. But it had surfaced, and that, Silas understood without letting himself understand it fully, was the thing about grief. It never went where you told it to. It only went quiet and waited and found its moment. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of winter morning that follows a bad storm, where the light off the snow makes everything too sharp, and the air has the quality of something newly emptied. Silas was saddling the gray mare in the barn before full light, and Eliza appeared in the doorway with the chest in a leather pack across her back and her coat, still inadequate, but covered now with an old canvas ranch coat of Silas's that hung past her knees and was approximately 4 sizes wrong and did not appear to concern her in the slightest. Owen was behind her. His face had the specific expression of a boy trying very hard not to show that he is worried, which on Owen looked exactly like concentrated, intense seriousness. You'll be back in 5 days, Owen said. It came out as a statement of fact, the kind of fact a 10-year-old constructs out of determination because the alternative is not acceptable. 5 days, Silas confirmed. Owen looked at Eliza. You'll make sure he's careful. Eliza looked at this boy for a moment and something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly, like a window that has been painted shut finally being persuaded. He seems like a man who's careful on his own. He's not, Owen said, with the certainty of someone who has 14 years' worth of case studies. Eliza almost smiled. I'll keep an eye on him. Owen nodded, apparently satisfied. He stepped back from the door, and Silas caught something in his face as he turned, not the worry, which had been managed, but something underneath it, something that looked almost like he was already waiting for them to come back, and the waiting had already started. Finn appeared from nowhere, still in his nightshirt despite the cold, and grabbed Silas around the middle with both arms and held on for a moment with the fierce, uncomplicated grip of a 7-year-old. Silas put one hand on the back of his son's head and held it there. 5 days? Finn said into his coat. 5 days. Finn let go. He looked at Eliza. Don't let him eat all the trail food first. He does that. I do not do that, Silas said. He absolutely does that, Finn said to Eliza. She did smile then, briefly, and it was the real kind. I'll ration it. Finn nodded with great satisfaction and went back inside before the cold could find him properly. Silas and Eliza rode out of the yard in the early light, the gray mare in his own bay moving through snow that reached past the horse's knees in the drifts and was firmer on the open ground. The ranch fell away behind them, the cabin's smoke rising straight up in the still air, and Silas did not look back after the first turn. He looked forward, at the white road ahead, and the tree line, and the mountains still half hidden in morning cloud, and beside him Eliza rode with the wooden chest at her back and her eyes on the distance, and neither of them spoke for a while. Then she said, I haven't told you everything. He kept his eyes on the road. I figured. About the fire, she paused. About what I had to do to get out of Archer Creek with those documents. You don't have to tell me now. I think I should. She was quiet for a moment, adjusting the reins in her chapped hands. Creed's man came to me in October, not Pritchard, another one. He offered me money for the chest, a reasonable amount by most measures. You said no. I said no. He came back 2 nights later. She touched the line of the old cut along her jaw without seeming to realize she was doing it. There were 2 of them the second time. Silas's hands tightened on the reins. I had the chest under the floorboard, she said. They didn't find it. I got out through the back of the building I was staying in and I kept moving. She looked ahead. I've been keeping moving since October. 2 months. 2 months. She glanced at him. I want you to understand what you're riding into. You said that last night. I mean it more specifically now. She looked back at the road. Creed's men aren't going to stop at asking. They haven't been stopping at asking since October. Then it's a good thing I didn't leave you at the door on Christmas Eve, Silas said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Yes, she said finally, quietly. It is. The road south stretched white and unmarked ahead of them, through the pine tree shadows and the open fields and the long, cold silence of a valley that had been scoured clean by a storm and was still finding its footing again. The hooves made a soft, rhythmic sound in the packed snow, and somewhere overhead a hawk crossed the white sky and disappeared behind the tree line. Behind them, the ranch sat steady under its smoke, and inside it, 3 boys were starting a morning that their father would have to trust to them for the next several days. Which was, Silas thought, exactly the kind of trust that either worked or taught you something hard about the limits of what you can hold. He had built everything on that land with his hands. He had buried grief in it and planted hope in it and worked it through every season. He had thought, for 3 years, that keeping it intact meant keeping everything exactly as it was. He was beginning to understand that wasn't preservation. That was just fear with good posture. The road curved south and they followed it, and the valley opened up around them, and ahead somewhere through the white distance was Caldwell Station and a lawyer, and the chance that justice could still mean something in a county that had been running on Harlan Creed's definition of it for too long. It wasn't a certainty. Silas had lived long enough to know the difference between a plan and a guarantee, but it was a direction, and for the first time in 3 years, moving in a direction felt like enough. They made 12 miles the first day, which was better than Silas had expected and worse than they needed. The southern route was longer by design, 2 extra days of riding in exchange for avoiding the northern road where Creed's men would be watching. But longer also meant more exposed in certain stretches, more dependent on the weather holding, and more dependent on horses that had spent 4 days confined in a storm barn and were not entirely thrilled about the sudden demand for sustained effort in deep snow. The gray mare handled it better than the bay. Eliza had a light hand with the reins, the kind that comes from years of genuine familiarity rather than instruction, and the mare responded to it. Silas's bay was older and opinionated and communicated his dissatisfaction through a series of head movements that Silas had learned to interpret over 6 years of partnership and mostly ignored. They stopped before dark at a stand of pine that provided reasonable windbreak and some ground clear enough of drifts to make a fire practical. Silas built it while Eliza saw to the horses, and when she came back she was carrying the canvas pack with their supplies and moving with the economical efficiency that he was beginning to recognize as simply the way she existed in a difficult situation. No wasted motion, no performance of composure, just the thing done, and then the next thing. "How's the mare?" he asked. "Good. She'll be fine tomorrow." Eliza crouched near the fire and started on the food without being asked. "Your bay is sulking." "He sulks. It's his way. It's a horse. He's a particular horse." Silas fed the fire another branch. "He sulked for 2 weeks when I sold his pasture companion 3 years ago." Eliza looked at him over the fire with an expression he was starting to learn meant she was revising her assessment of something. "You kept a sulking horse for 6 years. He's useful. He's just also unreasonable." He paused. "I'm told I have a type." She almost made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the closest thing to it he'd heard from her when something wasn't specifically funny to Finn. They ate dried meat and cornbread that Eliza had packed that morning, with the same practical quiet she brought to everything, and the fire held against the cold, and the horses moved now and then in the dark beyond the firelight, and the stars above the pine canopy were the hard, brilliant kind that only come out after a storm has cleaned the sky. "Tell me about your husband," Silas said. She looked up from her food. He hadn't planned to say it. He said it anyway, the way you say things sometimes when the dark and the fire together make the ordinary rules of careful conversation feel less necessary. "Why?" she asked. "Because you've been carrying him in that chest for 2 months without putting him down, and that seems like something that needs more room than a wooden box." She looked at the fire for a moment. "His name was Daniel Rowan." She said it the way people say a name they haven't said out loud in a while, testing the sound of it, checking whether it still fits the shape of what they knew. "He built things. Furniture, mostly. He had a workshop at the edge of our settlement, and he could look at a piece of raw wood and tell you what was in it before he started." She was quiet for a moment. "He was not an easy man to know. He didn't talk much. He had strong opinions about small things and very few opinions about large things, which I always thought was backward." The faintest softening in her face. "He was a good father, better than he expected to be." "And your daughter?" "Clara." Just the name, placed into the air. "She had his eyes and my stubbornness, and she was going to be a problem for somebody someday." A pause. "I like that about her." Silas looked at the fire. "They were in the house," Eliza said. "Daniel and Clara. I was at the meal service when it started. I heard the bell and I ran, and by the time I got there..." She stopped. Started again, differently. "I have gone over every sequence of that night more times than I can count, looking for the thing I could have done. There isn't one. I know there isn't one. I know it, and I still look." "That's not a flaw," Silas said. "That's just what it is." "Your wife," she said. "Fever. She was sick for 9 days and then she wasn't there." He picked up a stick and turned it in his hands. "I was in the room. I watched it happen, and I still went over it the same way, looking for the moment where I could have done something different." "Did you find it?" "No. But you kept looking anyway." "For about a year. Then I stopped because the boys needed me to be somewhere other than inside that question." Eliza nodded slowly. "The chest," she said. "I open it sometimes at night, just to look at the photographs. Daniel and Clara." She looked at the fire. "It's not a healthy thing, probably, but it's the thing I do." "It keeps them real," Silas said. "Yes." She looked at him with something in her face that was direct and unguarded in a way that the daytime version of her tended not to be. "That's exactly it." They sat with the fire for a while after that without talking, and it was not a difficult silence. It was the kind that two people sometimes arrive at when they have said enough of the true things that the remaining quiet feels earned rather than empty. He slept lighter than he would have at home, one ear on the dark around the camp, the way a man does when he has reason to be watchful. Twice he came fully awake at sounds that turned out to be nothing, the horses shifting, a branch dropping its snow load. The third time he came awake, it was because the fire had gone low and needed feeding, and when he sat up he found Eliza already awake, cross-legged near the coals, the chest open in her lap, looking at something he couldn't see from his angle. She closed it when she heard him move. "Sleep," he said. "I will." He fed the fire and lay back down and did not say anything else, and after a while he heard her lie down too, and the camp settled back into the sounds of 2 people and 2 horses and a winter night that was not yet finished. The second day brought the first real problem. It came in the form of a creek crossing that Silas had counted on being passable and was not. The creek ran east-west across the southern route about 8 miles into the day's ride, and normally in December it would be frozen solid enough to cross with loaded horses without concern. But the storm had done something unpredictable to the ice, broken it up in the center section while leaving the banks frozen, and now there was open black water running through a gap too wide to jump and too uncertain to wade without serious risk. Silas sat on the bay at the bank and looked at it. "How far to the next crossing?" Eliza asked beside him. 4 miles east." He looked at the sky. The cloud cover had been building since mid-morning and had the particular color that meant snow by afternoon, almost certainly. 4 miles east puts us back close to the main road. And Creed's people. Possibly. She studied the creek. The ice on the left bank looks thicker. It does. If we go upstream about 50 yards, that bend, the water slows there. It might be solid all the way across. He looked at the bend she was indicating. She was right that it was a slower section. Might. Or we go 4 miles east and we chance the road. He thought about Pritchard in the yard, about the way the man had said legal ones, property ones, with the particular confidence of someone delivering a message from a person who has never needed to worry about what happens when his messages aren't received well. "We checked the bend," he said. The bend was not solid all the way across, but it was solid enough on the left bank that Silas could cross on foot and test the ice with his full weight and the full weight of his pack. And what he found was that there was one line, not wide, not comfortable, but passable, where the ice held without the terrifying deep groan that means you have seconds to move or don't. He brought the horses across one at a time, leading them by the bridle at the precise angle that kept their weight on the thicker sections, talking to them in the low, continuous voice that horses respond to, not because of the words, but because of what the sound means. "I am here. I am paying attention. Nothing surprising is about to happen." The gray mare crossed without incident. She was, as Eliza had said, fine. The bay stopped in the middle of the crossing, looked at Silas with an expression of profound personal grievance, and then completed the crossing in a lurch that cracked the ice behind his hind legs and sent cold water across Silas's right boot. He got the horse to the far bank and stood for a moment with one wet boot on the snow and felt the cold begin its work immediately. Eliza crossed behind them, the chest pack on her back, moving with the deliberate care of someone who has done physically difficult things in bad conditions before and knows that the worst mistakes happen when you rush. She made it across clean and stood on the far bank and looked at his boot. How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough." He was already thinking through what he had in the pack. "I've got an extra pair of stockings. If I stuff the boot with dry cloth and keep moving, it'll be manageable." Manageable is not the word I'd choose. "It's the word I've got." He started toward the horses. "We need to move before that snow comes in." She caught his arm briefly. "Sit down. 2 minutes." She was already going into her own pack. "Eliza, 2 minutes doesn't lose a day. A foot lost to cold does." She produced a cloth that had been wrapped around something else in the pack, dry, relatively speaking. "Sit." He sat on a fallen log at the bank's edge, and she knelt in the snow without appearing to notice that she was kneeling in the snow and worked the wet boot off with efficient hands, stuffed the dry cloth inside, wrung out the worst of the wet stocking and put it back on, then packed additional cloth around everything in a way that would hold body heat against the foot for several more hours. She worked without asking for his help or his opinion, and he let her because she knew what she was doing, and his foot was going numb, and this was not the moment for pride. "My father lost 2 toes on a winter crossing," she said, working. "He said the worst part was that he felt fine until he didn't." "I know the feeling." "I imagine you do." She pulled the boot back on and pressed the lacing tight. "Keep flexing your toes when you're in the saddle, every 10 minutes. You sound like a field medic." "I sound like someone who grew up in Ohio winters with a father who made poor decisions near water." She stood up and dusted snow off her knees. "2 of those don't make you a medic, they make you informed." He stood up, tested the boot's warmth, found it acceptable. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, just keep your toes moving." She was already heading for the horses. They pushed hard through the afternoon, the snow coming in as promised around the 2nd hour. But lighter than it had threatened, more nuisance than danger, laying a fresh thin coat over the packed surface of the road and reducing visibility enough to make Silas watchful without reducing it enough to make them stop. The route curved south and west, bending away from the valley's center, and the landscape changed gradually from the open ranch land Silas knew well to denser timber on the ridgeline and narrower passages between the trees. It was quieter in the timber, the snow muffling everything, and Silas found himself listening with more of his attention than the road seemed to require. He heard the riders before he saw them. Two sets of hooves, somewhere in the trees to the northeast, moving at a pace that was too purposeful for hunters and too quiet for people who didn't know they had reason to be quiet. "Behind us," he said quietly. "Northeast. Don't turn around." Eliza didn't turn around. Her hand moved to the chest pack at her back, checking it the way a person checks something they are not willing to lose. "How far?" "Quarter mile, moving roughly parallel." "They know where we are." "They know approximately." He kept the bay to a steady pace, not faster, not slower. Speed would confirm that they'd been spotted. "There's a logging cut about half a mile ahead, wide open, bad cover. We don't want to be in that when they decide to close the distance." "What's before it?" "A fork. Right fork goes into the timber, longer, comes out south of the cut." He paused. "It'll add 2 hours." "Does it have cover?" "More than the cut." "Then we take it." He didn't argue. They reached the fork and took it at the same measured pace, into the denser trees, and Silas spent the next quarter mile listening hard for whether the riders in the northeast would adjust their course. They did. Slower, because the timber was harder going, but they adjusted. Someone had told them the right fork was the option to choose if the quarry wanted cover, which meant someone with route knowledge had briefed them. "They know this area," Silas said. "Creed operates north and west. He'll have men who know the secondary roads." Eliza was scanning the trees on both sides without being obvious about it. "How many do you think?" "2 horses, 2 riders. Could be more staged ahead, but I'd guess 2. We can't outrun them in this timber with loaded horses." "No." He'd been working through the same calculation. "But we don't need to outrun them. We need to reach the Tanner homestead." He glanced at her. "About 3 miles south of the cut. Walter Tanner and I have an understanding. He won't be friendly to Creed's men." "How old an understanding?" "Old enough. I helped him hold his grazing rights 7 years ago when Creed's first expansion pushed into the East Valley." He paused. "Some debts don't expire." She absorbed this without comment, which he was coming to understand was one of her particular skills, taking in new information and adjusting around it without the need to narrate the adjustment. The timber track was slower going than the main route, and the light was failing faster under the canopy. Silas kept his ears on the northeast, and what he heard over the next half hour was that the riders were maintaining distance rather than closing, which meant either they were uncertain or they were waiting for something. He didn't like either option. They came out of the timber onto the approach to Tanner's homestead as the last gray light was leaving the sky, and Silas pushed the pace for the first time all day, because the open ground between the timber edge and Tanner's fence line was exactly where you didn't want to be if 2 riders decided to close the distance. The homestead was dark except for a single light in the main window, and Silas was almost to the gate when the door opened and a man stood against the light with a rifle across his chest. "Who's riding?" The voice was sharp and not friendly, the voice of a man who has learned that dusk visitors require identification before welcome. "Silas Boone," Silas said. A pause. Then the rifle angle changed. "Silas Boone from the valley?" "The same." Walter Tanner came off the porch at a walk, squinting through the dark at the 2 horses. He was a few years older than Silas, wider through the chest, with a face that had been weathered past the point where age made further impressions. He looked at Eliza, then back at Silas. "You look like hell," Walter said. "We've had a difficult 2 days." "Riders in the timber?" Silas looked at him. "You saw them." "My boy did. From the ridge about an hour ago. 2 men, Creed's colors." Walter looked at the tree line. "They've pulled back for now. Dark and uncertain terrain, they'll wait for morning." He stepped back toward the porch. "Get your horses in the barn. Come inside." Walter Tanner's homestead was smaller than Silas's and more worn at the edges, but the fire was good and the coffee was hot, and Walter's wife Alma moved with a quiet competence that reminded Silas, in a distant way, of watching Eliza work. She put food on the table without being asked, and didn't require explanations for the presence of a stranger before providing her the same courtesy she'd provide anyone. Walter listened to the summary of events, the documents, Creed's claim, the chest, the need to reach Caldwell Station, with his elbows on the table and his face doing very little. When Silas finished, Walter was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known Creed was behind the Archer Creek fire?" he said to Eliza. "Since the night it happened," she said. "I saw one of his men on the south side with a torch." "Jed Pritchard?" She looked at him. "You know the name?" "I know the face. He came through here last spring with a land offer for Alma's family property on the ridge." Walter's jaw tightened. "We declined. He came back in August. We declined again," with more emphasis. He looked at Silas. "Creed's been consolidating for 3 years. The Archer Creek settlement was in the middle of his expansion route. Which is why the documents matter," Eliza said. "If we can show that the settlement was on legitimately homesteaded land and that Creed's filing was fraudulent, the entire expansion gets called into question. Every acquisition he's made using that filing as a foundation." Walter looked at her steadily. "That's a lot of acquisitions." "Yes. That's going to make him desperate." "He's already desperate. He's had 2 men following us through the timber in December." Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The attorney in Caldwell Station, that's Marcus Webb?" Silas hadn't known the name. He looked at Eliza. "Webb," she confirmed. "You know him?" "Know of him. He handled the Garrison water rights case 4 years ago. Won it." Walter looked at Silas. "If she can get those documents to Webb, there's a real chance." He paused. "Getting there is the issue." "The southern route," Silas began. "Creed's men know the southern route. They followed you to my fence line." Walter pulled his coffee cup closer. "They'll be positioned ahead by morning, not just behind." He thought for a moment. "There's another way. Rougher. My son knows it. He's been running trap lines through the ridge country east of here since he was 14. There's a passage through the ridge that comes out 12 miles north of Caldwell Station. It's not a road, it's barely a track, but Creed won't have men on it because most people don't know it exists." "How long?" Eliza asked. "In current conditions? With good horses?" Walter considered. "1 hard day. You'd need to start before dawn and push through." Silas looked at Eliza. She looked at him. "1 hard day is better than 3 soft ones with men behind us," she said. Silas turned back to Walter. "Can your son take us through?" "I'll ask him." Walter stood up. "But Silas, there's something else." He set his cup down and looked at both of them with an expression that said what was coming had been sitting behind his teeth since they'd walked in. "Creed sent a rider north yesterday, before the storm fully cleared. I had a man in town who saw it." "To the county marshal," Silas said. "To the marshal, yes, but also to Judge Elmore." Walter's voice was flat. "Elmore's been in Creed's pocket since before you came to the valley. If Creed can get a writ issued before those documents reach Webb, it won't matter what they say. The chest will be seized as disputed property, and Webb won't be able to file anything." The kitchen went quiet enough that the fire sounded loud. "How long do we have?" Eliza's voice was steady. Silas noticed her hands on the table were not. "Elmore's in Caldwell Station on circuit until the 5th of January. Walter looked at her directly. "It's December 30th. 6 days. Except they didn't have 6 days because Creed wouldn't wait for Elmore to file a writ. Creed would move the moment he had the legal cover to do so, and the filing could happen the same day Elmore received the request, which meant, we need to reach Webb before Creed's rider reaches Elmore," Silas said. "Yes," Walter said. "How fast can Creed's rider move?" "Fast. He left yesterday on a clear road." Walter sat back down. "He's probably in Caldwell Station already." Eliza made a sound that was not quite profanity, but carried the same weight. She looked at the table for a moment, and then at the chest pack she'd set against the wall when she'd come in, and Silas watched something move through her face. Not defeat, because she was not a person who had defeat in her in the ordinary sense. More like the reorganization that happens when a plan meets reality, and reality wins on points, but not on outcome. "Then we move tonight," she said. "The ridge track in the dark," Walter began, "is safer than giving Creed's people all night to set up ahead of us." She looked at Walter. "Is your son awake?" Walter's son was named Cody Tanner, 20 years old, and he came downstairs with the unhurried confidence of someone who has been doing difficult outdoor things long enough that urgency doesn't register as alarm, just as information that changes the schedule. He listened to his father explain the situation, looked at Silas and Eliza, and said, "The ridge track in the dark is doable if you've got a horse that won't panic at uncertain footing." "The gray mare," Eliza said immediately. "And yours?" Cody looked at Silas. "He'll panic," Silas said honestly. "He'll panic, and then he'll cooperate." Cody nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable description of a horse. "We'd go single file. I know every section." He looked at his father. 4 hours to the ridge, 3 down the other side. If we're moving by 9, we hit Caldwell Station by early afternoon. Walter looked at Silas. Silas looked at Eliza. She was already standing up, reaching for the chest pack. They ate quickly. Alma had put together something substantial without being asked: cold meat and bread and dried apple, enough to carry them through the night ride. And Silas took 10 minutes in the barn to check the horse's legs again and resaddle with the particular care of someone who knows that what happens in the next 12 hours will not be forgiving of careless preparation. Cody Tanner prepared his own horse with the fluid efficiency of someone who has been doing it since before he was tall enough to reach the saddle without a stool. He packed light, a rifle, a water skin, a coil of rope, and checked the sky with the professional assessment of a young man whose life has depended on reading weather. "Cloud cover's good," he said. "Diffuse light off the snow. We'll be able to see." "How do you know the track in the dark?" Eliza asked. "I've run it at night twice. Traplines don't care what time it is." He swung up. "Stay on my right shoulder. If I hold up my hand, stop. Don't talk unless you have to. Sound carries in the timber at night." Silas got on the bay, who expressed his feelings about being saddled again in the dark through a series of ear movements that communicated something between indignation and resignation. Eliza was up on the gray mare in a single motion. Walter stood at the barn door. He looked at Silas for a moment with something in his face that men of a certain age and experience recognize in each other: the acknowledgement that what is being attempted is serious, and the people attempting it know it and are doing it anyway. "Straight through to Webb," Walter said. "Don't stop in town, don't announce yourselves. Go directly to his office." He paused. "And Silas?" "Yeah, if Creed's men are positioned on the ridge, we'll deal with it." Walter didn't look entirely satisfied with this answer, but he stepped back and let them ride out. The night swallowed them within 50 yards of the barn. Cody set a pace that was faster than Silas expected and more assured. He moved through the dark timber with the same confidence he might have had at noon, reading the track by memory and by the subtle variations in the snow surface that told him where the ground was firm and where it dropped or turned. Silas rode his shoulder as instructed and spent the first hour entirely focused on the horse beneath him and the pale shape of Cody's jacket ahead and the sounds of the dark forest around them. It was Eliza who heard it first. "Left," she said, barely above a breath. "Movement. 200 yards." Cody held up his hand and they stopped. The dark timber was still. Then, there, at the edge of perception, something moving between the trees. Not an animal sound, the wrong rhythm for an animal. The particular uneven crunch of a horse being walked slowly through packed snow by someone who is trying not to make noise. One horse, one rider. Silas turned his head slowly toward Cody. Cody was already reading it, his body very still on his horse, looking left at the trees. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed forward, then curved his hand to the right. They would swing right, go around. The next quarter mile was the longest Silas had ridden in years. Every footfall the bay made sounded enormous in his ears, and he was acutely aware of the irony that he was now the one trying to make no noise, when noise had never particularly been something he'd had to manage before. The rider in the trees did not follow. Either they hadn't heard, or they were positioned as a marker rather than a pursuing force, waiting for others to drive the quarry toward them. When they were 200 yards beyond the position, Cody picked up the pace again, and Silas breathed. The ridge came up at the 3-hour mark, and it was everything that implied. A long, brutal climb through ground that was more rock than trail, the snow unpredictable on the steep sections, the horses earning every foot of elevation with visible effort. Silas worked with the bay rather than against him, letting the horse find his own footing, trusting the animal's instinct for ground that would hold and ground that wouldn't. Eliza said nothing for the entire climb. She was focused entirely on the gray mare, riding with the full attention of someone who understands that in certain situations, the horse's welfare and your own are not 2 problems, but one. They reached the ridge just before dawn. Cody pulled up at the top and let the horses breathe, and for a minute they sat in the dark up there above the timberline, with the whole valley behind them and the distance ahead, and the sky to the east was just beginning to separate light from dark in the way that means morning is coming whether anyone is ready or not. Silas looked at Eliza. She had snow in her hair, and her face was drawn with the cold and the long night, and she was looking at the eastern sky with an expression that he had no single word for. Not hope exactly. Something more complicated than hope and less fragile. "Downhill from here," Cody said. "Good," said Eliza. She looked at Silas. "Ready?" He thought about his boys at the ranch, about Tom Henderson's 2 working hands, about Wyatt's face in the barn when he'd said bring her back safe. He thought about the chest at Eliza's back and what was inside it and what it cost to carry it. "Ready," he said. They started down the far side of the ridge toward Caldwell Station, and the morning came up around them cold and clear. And somewhere ahead, a lawyer named Marcus Webb was either already in his office or about to be. And somewhere behind them, Harlan Creed was running out of time to stop what was already in motion. Caldwell Station announced itself first as smoke, 4 or 5 thin columns rising from the valley below the ridge, catching the morning light in a way that looked almost peaceful from a distance. The kind of sight that reminds a tired person that civilization exists and has fires and probably coffee. Up close, it was a working town with no pretensions about it. A main street that turned to mud under the snow melt at the edges, a livery, 2 general stores, a telegraph office, a courthouse that was newer than everything around it, and the assortment of smaller buildings that accumulate around any place where people have decided to stop moving and try to make something work. It was not large, but it had a lawyer named Marcus Webb, and that was what mattered. Cody Tanner brought them down off the ridge track and onto the approach road by mid-morning, exactly when he'd said he would, and then turned his horse north without ceremony. "Webb's office is on the east side of the main street," he said. "Painted green, which is a choice. You can't miss it." He looked at Silas. "I'll head back over the ridge before the snow softens. Tell my father we made it through." "Tell him I owe him," Silas said. Cody shook his head once, the way young men do when they're uncomfortable with the language of debt. "Just deal with Creed," he said, and rode north. They watched him go for a moment, and then Eliza turned the gray mare toward the main street without waiting to be prompted. She was running on something beyond tired at this point. Silas could see it. The particular forward lean of a person whose body has been informed that stopping is not an option and has reluctantly agreed to cooperate until further notice. Her hands were steady on the reins, but her face was very drawn, the cold having done its work on her over 3 days of hard riding, and there was a tightness around her eyes that he recognized as the expression of someone managing pain they have declined to mention. He brought the bay up alongside the mare. "Your hands." She looked at them briefly. The knuckles were cracked and red, worse than they'd been at the ranch. "They're fine." "They don't look fine." "They'll be fine when this is finished." She kept moving. "Green building, east side." It was not hard to find. The green paint was the particular shade of a decision made with confidence and subsequently regretted, but it had been applied thoroughly, and the sign above the door read, "Marcus Webb, attorney at law," in letters that meant business. The door was closed, but there was lamplight in the window, which meant someone was inside. They tied the horses at the post, and Eliza took the chest pack from her back and held it against her chest with both arms in exactly the way she'd been holding it when she'd knocked on Silas's door 6 days ago. He noticed, and he thought she didn't notice him noticing, and then he saw the faint compression at the corner of her mouth that told him she'd noticed after all, and had decided not to address it. He pushed the door open and held it. The office was one room, practical and overfull in the way of working lawyers who keep everything because they've learned that the thing they throw away is always the thing they need. Shelves of bound volumes on 3 walls, a large desk with paper stacked in organized disorder, a coal stove in the corner doing adequate work, and behind the desk a man of about 55, who looked up from whatever he was reading with the expression of someone interrupted mid-thought who is choosing to be professional about it. Marcus Webb was not what Silas had expected. He'd expected the lawyer type that Creed would probably have on his side, polished, deliberate, the kind of man who has learned to make money look like principle. Webb looked like he'd been a working man before he was a lawyer and hadn't entirely left it behind. His hands on the desk were large and his face had some weather in it, and his eyes behind his reading glasses moved between Silas and Eliza with a quickness that suggested the mind behind them was running calculations before anyone had spoken. "Mr. Webb," Eliza said. "Yes." He set down his papers. "You look like you've had a significant journey." 3 days. Over the Tanner Ridge last night. Something shifted in his expression. "In this weather." "We had a reason to avoid the main road." She set the chest on his desk. "My name is Eliza Rowan. I had a settlement near Archer Creek. It burned in April. I have documents that establish Harlan Creed's fraudulent land claim as the foundation for the fire and for his expansion across the Eastern Valley over the past 3 years." Webb looked at the chest, then at Eliza, then at Silas. "Silas Boone," Silas said. "I'm a neighbor. Also a property owner Creed has been trying to acquire for several years." "I know your name," Webb said. He looked back at Eliza. "Sit down, Miss Rowan, both of you." He stood and went to the stove and poured coffee into 2 cups that had clearly been washed at some point in the recent past and set them on the desk. "Start from the beginning." She started from the beginning. It took 40 minutes, and Silas watched Webb listen the way he imagined a good lawyer listened. Not passively, not dramatically, but with the specific engaged attention of someone who is simultaneously hearing what is being said and sorting it into categories of relevance and use. He interrupted 3 times, each time with a question that cut directly to the legal pressure point of what she'd just described. He examined each document as it came out of the chest with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows what he's looking at and is checking whether what he sees matches what he expected to see. When she produced the Jedediah Cole witness statement, Webb was quiet for longer than he'd been quiet before. "This is signed," he said, "in front of 2 witnesses. Their names are on the document. Do you know where Cole is now?" "Oregon, last I knew. He left the territory in May. Traceable through territorial records, probably." Webb set the document down with the particular precision of a man handling something he has decided is important. "The survey records predate Creed's filing by 7 years. That alone is enough to challenge the foundational claim." He looked up. "Combined with the witness statement, this is not a weak case, Miss Rowan." "No," she said. "I didn't think it was." "The problem is time." Webb leaned back in his chair and put his hands flat on the desk. "Judge Elmore is in town until the 5th. I have reason to believe Creed has already been in contact with him." "We know," Silas said. "Walter Tanner told us." Webb nodded slowly. "If Elmore issues a seizure writ for the documents before I can file a formal challenge to Creed's claim, I lose the ability to use them. They become disputed property in a dispute that Elmore controls." He looked at Eliza. "How quickly did you want to move on this? How quickly can you file?" "Today. This afternoon, if I work through lunch." He paused. "But filing today means Creed knows today. And a man like Creed, when he understands the game, has changed." "He already knows the general direction," Silas said. "He had men on the ridge last night. He knows she's in Caldwell Station." "Then he'll move fast." Webb stood up. "I'm going to need you both to stay available. There are affidavits to sign, and when this moves, and it will move quickly, I'll need Miss Rowan's direct testimony available." "We're not going anywhere," Eliza said. Webb looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was professional appreciation, not for her appearance, not for her courage in the dramatic sense, but for the kind of functional reliability that lawyers depend on in witnesses and don't always find. "Good," he said. He showed them to a boarding house 2 doors down, run by a woman named Mrs. Ferris, who charged a fair rate and asked no questions about the nature of their business, which was the kind of discretion that suggested she'd housed people in complicated situations before and had developed a policy. Silas paid for 2 rooms. He almost said something when she raised an eyebrow at the 2 separate rooms, not because he owed her an explanation, but because the gesture of it felt more visible than he'd intended, a kind of declaration by way of allocation. He didn't say anything. He took his key and Eliza took hers, and they went upstairs. He slept for 3 hours and woke up feeling like he'd been dragged behind the bay for part of that time. His foot had held up better than expected. Eliza's work at the creek bank had brought him through without real damage, but the accumulated cold of 3 nights had settled into his lower back in a way that made him move carefully when he got out of bed. He washed, changed what could be changed from the limited supply in his pack, and went downstairs. Eliza was already in the small front room, sitting at the table near the window with a cup of tea that had probably gone cold, looking out at the street with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to watch public spaces for the specific kind of movement that doesn't belong. She had changed too. Her hair was down and repinned in a way that was different from the traveling arrangement, and someone, Mrs. Ferris probably, had found her a better coat than her own. She looked less like someone in the middle of a desperate cross-country ride, and more like a person who had briefly remembered what it felt like to be still. "Anything?" he asked, meaning the street. "One of Creed's men has been in front of the general store across the street for the past hour," she said. "He's not buying anything." Silas looked out the window. A man in a canvas coat leaning against the porch rail with his hat down. "You recognize him?" "He was one of the two who came to my lodgings in October." Her voice was even. "The first time." Silas looked at the man for a moment. "He knows you're here." "He knew before we arrived. Creed's a man who prepares." "So is Webb." Silas sat down across from her. "He file yet?" "He sent a boy to tell me he'd be ready by 4 o'clock. She looked at her cold tea. 2 hours. "Then we wait." She nodded. Neither of them particularly liked waiting, which was something they hadn't needed to discuss to know about each other. "Your boys will be wondering," she said. "Wyatt will be managing. The other two will be wondering." He paused. "Finn is probably fine as long as the Henderson children are still there. He's got an audience." "Owen will be counting things," she said, "trying to make the numbers work." He looked at her. She'd known them less than a week and she already had the shape of them. "Probably." "He's going to be something," she said. "Not sweet, not sentimental, just observational. That kind of mind, if it goes in the right direction." "I think about that." Silas looked at the street. "I think about what Margaret would have seen in them at this age. She was better at... She saw them more clearly than I do. I see them through what I need them to be." "Most parents do." "That's not an excuse." "No. But it's human." She looked at the man in the canvas coat across the street. "My husband was the same way with Clara. He was so determined she wouldn't struggle the way he had that he sometimes couldn't just watch her be 4 years old." A pause. "I used to tell him to put down the plans for her and just eat breakfast with her." "Did he?" "Sometimes." The softest thing he'd heard in her voice. Sometimes he got it exactly right. The 2 hours passed the way waiting hours do, in a combination of small tasks and large silences, and the particular heightened awareness of people who know that something is about to shift and cannot make it shift faster by wanting it to. Webb came for them at 10 minutes past 4, arriving at Mrs. Ferris's door with a leather briefcase and an expression that was composed in the way of a man who has done what he set out to do and is now moving to the next necessary thing. "Filed at 3:45, he said. "Formal challenge to Creed's foundational land claim, attached to the survey documents and the coal statement. It's on record." He paused. "Elmore has been notified, as required by procedure. He has until tomorrow morning to respond." "And if he issues the writ anyway?" Silas asked. "Then it goes to the territorial court in Cheyenne, which does not answer to Elmore or to Creed's money." Webb looked at Eliza. "Your affidavit needs to be signed tonight. I've prepared it. And there are 2 other things." "What things?" Eliza asked. "First, there's a woman at my office who has been waiting since 2 o'clock. She says she knows you." He watched Eliza's face. "Her name is Agnes Rowan." Eliza went very still. "Your cousin?" Silas asked. She didn't answer immediately. She was doing something internal that he recognized. The adjustment a person makes when a thing they'd stopped fully believing in presents itself as real. "Agnes is in Caldwell Station," she said, more to herself than to either of them. "She's been here since November," Webb said. "She came to me in December when she heard the name Archer Creek connected to a land dispute. She's been waiting to see if you'd appear." Eliza stood up from the table. "You said 2 things. The second is less welcome." Webb looked at Silas. "Harlan Creed arrived in Caldwell Station an hour ago. He's at the hotel." The room was quiet for a moment. "Himself?" Silas said. "Not just his men." "Himself, and 4 of them with him." Webb set his briefcase on the table. "He knows the filing happened. He'll be with Elmore tonight." Silas looked at Eliza. She was looking at the window, at the street, at the man in the canvas coat who had probably already sent word that they were at the boarding house. "Does it matter?" she said. "The filing is on record." "It matters if Elmore agrees to see him before the morning," Webb said carefully. "A writ issued tonight before I can respond creates a different situation." "How different?" "Different enough that it buys Creed time he can use." Webb's voice was level. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Rowan. The filing is solid and I believe it will hold. But Creed is not a man who accepts outcomes he doesn't control, and he has both the resources and the local relationships to complicate the next 12 hours significantly." Eliza picked up her coat from the chair back. "Then let's go sign the affidavit." She walked out the door before either of them had fully stood up. Webb's office was a 4-minute walk. Eliza walked it like someone who has stopped worrying about who might be watching because the watching is no longer the point. The filing was done. The documents were on record. And whatever Creed attempted from here would be operating against a fact rather than a possibility. Agnes Rowan was sitting in the one chair in Webb's office that wasn't covered in documents. She was older than Eliza by 10 years, broader, with a face that suggested she had been worried for a long time, and had managed it by continuing to function. She stood when Eliza came through the door, and the two women looked at each other for a moment across the room with an expression that Silas had no business witnessing closely. So he moved to examine the bookshelves. "I thought you might not make it," Agnes said. Her voice was rough. "I very nearly didn't." Eliza's voice was not rough. It was the opposite of rough, which was somehow more. He heard them move together, and he studied the spines of legal volumes he had no interest in, and the fire in the stove popped, and outside the window the street had gone dark with early winter evening. The affidavit took 40 minutes to prepare and sign, Webb asking questions in the careful, sequential manner of a man building an argument brick by brick. Eliza answering with the same directness she brought to everything, including the moments when the questions touched the hardest parts. The night of the fire, what she saw, what she lost, what she'd done with the 60 days between then and now. Silas signed a supporting affidavit as well. His corroboration of Creed's behavior at the ranch, Pritchard in the yard, the intimidation implicit in the visit, was a smaller piece of the picture, but Webb wanted it documented, and Silas had no objection to documentation. When it was done, Webb locked the signed documents in the heavy iron safe behind his desk with the deliberateness of a man who has learned not to trust filing cabinets when the opposition has money. "Now," Webb said, settling back in his chair, "we wait for morning." "And if Creed comes tonight," Silas said. "Not legally, the other way." Webb looked at him steadily. "Is that a realistic concern?" "He's had men following us across the ridge country in a December blizzard." "Yes," Silas said. "It's a realistic concern." Webb was quiet for a moment. "There's a constable in town, Hank Burrows. He's not Creed's man. I can tell you that with reasonable confidence, because I've watched him for 4 years. If you're worried about tonight, his house is at the north end of the main street." "I'll remember that," Silas said. They ate at Mrs. Ferris's table. She produced a supper that was better than the surroundings suggested possible, a practical woman's response to guests who were clearly in some form of difficulty. Agnes joined them, sitting beside Eliza and conducting a quiet running conversation in the undertone of two people who have family history and shorthand and are catching up on months of distance in real time. Silas ate and listened to the street. He'd set his chair at an angle where he could see the front window, and what he saw in the hour after dark was the pattern he'd expected. Creed's man in the canvas coat was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize who was less obvious about it, walking past the boarding house twice in 20 minutes. 2 passes. Then nothing. Which was in some ways more concerning than the obvious watching. After supper, Agnes took Eliza upstairs and Silas sat in the front room with the lamp turned low and thought about what he knew and what he didn't know and what the night was likely to do with both. He knew Creed was at the hotel, which was 4 buildings west. He knew Elmore had been notified of the filing. He knew Webb believed the case was solid and that Elmore's ability to interfere was limited now that the filing was on record. He did not know whether Creed had decided that legal means were still his primary approach, or whether 3 days of failed pursuit had shifted his calculation. He was still thinking about it when the knock came at the front door. Not desperate, not aggressive, measured. The knock of a man who wants to appear in control of the situation, regardless of the situation. "Mrs. Ferris looked at Silas from across the room. He shook his head slightly and stood up and went to the door himself. Harlan Creed was not what the name had prepared him for. Silas had built an image over years of dealing with Creed's representatives and Creed's methods. And the image was of someone large and deliberate and certain, the kind of man who has accumulated enough power that his body has learned to take up space accordingly. Creed was medium height, lean, with a neat beard going gray, and eyes that were the particular shade of pale that catches light in a way that makes people uncomfortable without being able to say exactly why. He wore a good coat and no obvious weapon, which told Silas that the weapons were being held by the two men standing 6 feet behind him on the porch. "Mr. Boone," Creed said. His voice was the voice of a man who has run meetings his entire life and expects them to go the way he has arranged for them to go. "I'd like a word." "It's late," Silas said. "I'll be brief." "You can be brief here." A slight tightening around Creed's eyes, the only visible response to not getting the arrangement he'd wanted. "The documents your friend brought from Archer Creek are based on incomplete records. There are filings that contradict what she's presented to Webb. If she pursues this, she'll find the case is more complicated than she believes." "She's welcome to find that in court," Silas said. "Court is a long process, expensive." Creed's voice was careful and reasonable and completely without warmth. "Miss Rowan has been through a significant ordeal. There is a financial resolution that would allow her to rebuild without the cost and difficulty of litigation, a substantial one." "She doesn't want your money." "How do you know what she wants?" "Because I've spent 3 days riding across Ridge Country in December to get her to the lawyer she asked to see." Silas kept his voice level and his body still. "She knows what she wants." Creed looked at him for a long moment. The two men behind him hadn't moved. "You're putting yourself in the middle of something that isn't your concern, Boone." "You put yourself in the middle of my concern when you sent Pritchard to my yard," Silas said. "Before that, when you started making offers on my water rights that didn't improve regardless of the answer I gave." He looked at Creed directly. "We've been moving toward this conversation for a while." Something shifted in Creed's face. Not anger exactly. The recalibration of a man who has concluded that the approach that works on most people is not going to work here and is deciding what comes next. "The filing won't hold," he said. Elmore can do what he's able to do," Silas said. "And then it goes to Cheyenne. I understand that's how it works." Creed was quiet for a moment. The lamp behind Silas cast light past him onto the porch, and in it Creed's face was very clear and very cold. "You have 3 sons," he said. Everything in Silas went still. Not afraid, past afraid, into the territory on the other side of it, where a man gets very quiet and very certain about what he will and won't accept. "Yes," he said. "I do. It would be unfortunate for them to find themselves without—" "Stop." Silas's voice was quiet enough that Creed stopped. "I want you to hear me very clearly. You can threaten my water rights. You can send riders to my fence line. You can go see Elmore tonight and file whatever a man like you files when he's losing. But you don't say my boys' names. You don't refer to my boys. You don't look in the direction of my boys." His voice had not risen. It didn't need to. "If something happens at my ranch while I'm here, I will hold you responsible, personally. And I will make sure every person in this valley and in Cheyenne understands exactly who is responsible. Are we clear?" Creed held his gaze for a moment, then the smallest retreat, a shift in his posture, a reduction in the certainty that had walked up the porch steps. "The filing won't hold," he said again, but it landed differently the second time. "Good night, Mr. Creed," Silas said. He closed the door. He stood with his hand on the latch for a moment and felt his pulse in his throat, which was an honest response to what had just happened, and he allowed it. Then he went back to his chair by the window and sat down and watched the street. Creed and his men moved west, back toward the hotel, at a pace that was controlled but not leisurely. Eliza's voice came from the top of the stairs. "He came himself." "Yes." "What did he say?" "He offered money. Then he made an implication about the boys." Silas looked at the window. "I clarified my position." She came down the stairs and stood at the bottom, looking at him with an expression that was complicated in the way of someone who has just understood the full scope of what another person has done on their behalf. "Silas, he won't do anything tonight," Silas said. "He's going to see Elmore. That's the move he has left." He looked at her. "Go sleep. You need it." She stood at the bottom of the stairs for another moment. The boys are fine. Wyatt's there. He said it with more certainty than he felt, because the certainty was necessary and because he had chosen to extend the trust, and you didn't extend a trust by spending the night second-guessing it. Go sleep. She went back upstairs. He stayed by the window. He dozed twice and came fully awake twice, and nothing moved in the street in any way that concerned him. And by 4 in the morning, the cold had deepened enough that even the occasional horses passing through had stopped. The town was as still as a town gets. He was awake and dressed when Webb came at 7, earlier than expected, which told Silas something before the man spoke. Elmore refused the writ, Webb said. He set it at the door, not waiting to come inside, unable to hold it longer than necessary. He reviewed Creed's request last night and declined to issue it. The filing stands. Silas looked at him. Why? Because the survey documents are dated and official, and refusing a valid filing on their basis would create a record that could follow Elmore to Cheyenne. Webb came inside now that the sentence was out. He's corrupt, but he's not stupid. He won't put his name to something this visible. So it goes forward. It goes forward. The territorial court in Cheyenne will have the full filing by the end of the week. Webb accepted the coffee Mrs. Ferris appeared with as if he'd expected it. It will take months, not days. Creed has resources and he'll use them. But the foundational claim is challenged on record, and with the Cole statement, I believe we have a strong case. Eliza came downstairs. She read Webb's face before he turned to speak to her. It held, she said. It held. She sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a moment, those cracked, red, capable hands, and did not say anything. Agnes came and sat beside her and put one large hand over both of Eliza's, and that was the extent of the display. It was enough. Silas watched it from the doorway and thought about the chest upstairs in Eliza's room, with Daniel's photographs and Clara's memory inside it, and about 6 days of riding and 3 nights of inadequate sleep, and the cold that had gotten into everything, and Wyatt's voice saying, "Bring her back safe." He had done the thing. He had not entirely known, when he opened the door on Christmas Eve in a blizzard, that this was what he was doing, but looking back at the chain of it, the door, the chest, the documents, the ridge, Caldwell Station, Webb, Creed on the porch, it all pulled in one direction from the beginning. He was not a man who believed in neat meanings imposed on difficult events. He had lived long enough to know that most things don't mean what you want them to mean, that the story you tell about your own life is always somewhat more organized than the thing itself. But he thought about Finn's arms around his middle in the barn, and about Owen counting days, and about Wyatt's particular combination of wariness and reluctant acknowledgement, and he thought about Eliza's hand on his wrist in the kitchen the night before they left, cold and certain. The filing held. The documents were on record. Creed was not finished. Men like Creed were never finished in a single morning, but he was diminished in the way that matters most to a man like that. He was opposed by something legitimate, something on record, something that didn't need to hide. And they could go home. Silas turned to Webb. How soon can we leave? I'll need you both available by telegraph for the next few weeks as the case develops, Webb said. But physically, you can go today. I have everything I need. Silas looked at Eliza. She looked at Agnes, who gave her the particular nod of a family member who understands that someone's life is somewhere other than where they're sitting. Agnes will be all right, Eliza said. She was looking at Silas when she said it, and what she was saying was not only about Agnes, and they both understood that. There are 3 boys at a ranch who have been running things for 5 days, Silas said, and I need to see that foot properly dealt with before any more cold country riding. She looked down at his boot. It's been bothering you since the 2nd day. It's been manageable since the 2nd day. That's the same thing. It really isn't. But she was standing up, and there was something in the way she stood that was different from the way she'd stood for the past 3 days. Not lighter exactly, but less braced, as if the thing she'd been holding her body against had shifted enough that she could breathe without working at it. Agnes walked them to the horses. She held Eliza for a moment at the stirrup and said something into her ear, too low for Silas to catch, and Eliza nodded once and straightened up and swung into the gray mare's saddle. The morning was clear. The road north, the main road, because the reason for the southern route was behind them, was packed and passable, and the horses moved with the particular energy of animals who have rested and eaten properly and are being pointed toward familiar ground. They were a mile out of Caldwell Station, into the open valley where the mountains came into full view ahead, white-capped and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small human drama that had just concluded at their feet, when Eliza said, "Thank you." It was not a thank you for any single thing. They both understood that. "You've thanked me twice," Silas said. "This one is different." He looked at the road ahead. "You did the hard part. 2 months of hard part before I was even involved. You got me across the ridge. Cody got us across the ridge." "Silas." He looked at her. "Accept the thank you," she said, with a directness that was entirely her own, and that he had, he realized, become quietly dependent on. "Accepted," he said. They rode north, and the valley opened up around them, and somewhere ahead through the winter distance, the ranch was waiting with its smoke and its 3 boys and its accumulated ordinary life that was somehow, against all the reasonable expectations of 3 years of grief and solitude, no longer only his. He didn't let himself think too far past that. He was not a man who did well with the territory beyond what he could see from where he stood. But he could see the road and the mountains, and beside him the gray mare moving steady and sure, and that was enough for now. The rest could find its own time. They rode north for 2 days. The main road was better than the southern route had been, packed by use, wide enough for the horses to move side by side, and blessedly free of anyone in Creed's colors tracking them through the timber. The weather held in the grudging way of early January, cold but not violent, the sky a flat white that threatened nothing in particular and delivered on the threat. Silas's foot had been properly bandaged by a doctor in Caldwell Station before they left. A 10-minute visit that cost him more in pride than in money, because the doctor had looked at Eliza's field work at the creek bank and said, with the faint surprise of a man revising his expectations, that she had done exactly the right thing and probably saved him 2 toes. Eliza had received this information without comment. Silas had also received it without comment, though the comment he didn't make was considerably warmer than his expression suggested. They stopped the first night at a way station that served travelers on the main road, a rough place, 4 walls and a fire, and a man who charged $1 for the privilege of sleeping on a cot that had seen better decades. But it was warm, and the horses had a proper stall, and neither of them had any remaining argument against warmth. They ate at the common table with 2 other travelers, a pair of brothers moving cattle south for winter pasture, who talked about weather and grass conditions with the focused expertise of men for whom those 2 things were the primary organizing facts of existence. Silas contributed to the conversation where he could and let the rest wash past him. Eliza ate and said very little, which was not unusual for her in the presence of strangers. But he noticed that the silence had a different quality than the silences she'd been carrying for the past 3 days. Not the compressed, forward-leaning silence of someone managing a difficult situation, but something closer to the ordinary quiet of a person who is simply tired and warm and allowing themselves to be both. After supper, when the brothers had gone to their cots and the fire had settled to coals, she said, "Do you think he'll fight it all the way through?" She meant Creed. He'd known she did. "Yes," Silas said. "Men like him don't stop because they lose a filing. They adjust." Webb seems to think the territorial court is different from Elmore. Webb's probably right. Doesn't mean Creed won't find someone in Cheyenne to apply pressure to. He looked at the coals. It'll take time. Could be a year, could be more. But the record exists now. That's the thing he can't undo. "The record exists," she said, quietly, as if testing the weight of it. "What he did to that settlement, to your family, that's on paper now, with your name attached to it." He paused. "Whatever happens in court, that part's done." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't bring them back." "No." "I know it doesn't. I've known that since April." She looked at the dying fire. "I think I believed somewhere underneath everything that getting the documents to Webb would feel like, I don't know, completion, the end of something." She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't feel like the end of anything." "Probably because it isn't," Silas said. "The legal part is started. The rest of it, that doesn't have a filing date." She looked at him. "When did it get easier for you, with Margaret?" He thought about it honestly rather than reaching for the reassuring answer. "I'm not sure easier is the right word. It got different. There was a period where I woke up every morning and the first thought was her, and the thought was like hitting a wall. And then at some point the wall was still there, but I'd learned where it was, and I stopped walking into it quite so hard." He rubbed the back of his neck. And then the boys needed things. And needing things is useful. It gives you somewhere to put yourself. I don't have that. You have Agnes now. Agnes is not the same as... She stopped. You know what I mean. Yes. He did. He didn't pretend otherwise. What do you want, Eliza? Past Caldwell Station, past the documents, past all of it. What do you actually want? The question sat in the air between them. She looked at the fire for a long time. I want to not be temporary somewhere, she said finally. I've been moving since October, and before that I was in Archer Creek, which turned out to be temporary regardless of what I thought. I want to be somewhere that stays. She paused. I want to be useful in a way that matters, not just functional. I want it to matter. He held that. It mattered at the ranch, he said, to the Henderson children, to Owen with the darning, to Finn. A pause. To me. She looked at him. It was the direct, unguarded look she reserved for moments when she had decided that the careful version was not adequate to what was being said. You don't have to say that. I know I don't have to. He looked at the coals. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been finding reasons not to say it for a week, and I've run out of reasons that seem worth the trouble. The way station was quiet around them. Outside, the wind moved across the roof without any particular urgency, and the horses were still in their stalls, and the two cattle brothers were producing the sounds of men who sleep without difficulty. Your boys, she said. What about them? Wyatt doesn't trust easily. No. And I'm not past Daniel and Clara. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to tell you I am. I'm not past Margaret, he said. I don't think either of us will be past those people. I don't think that's how it works. He looked at her. But I'm not asking for past. I'm asking for present, whatever that is. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire went another degree darker and the room got incrementally colder around them. Let me see how Wyatt looks at me when we get back, she said finally. It was not a yes. It was not a no. It was the answer of a woman who had learned, the hard way, to deal in what was real rather than what was hoped for. He respected it for exactly what it was. Fair enough, he said. They reached the ranch on the afternoon of the second day, coming up the familiar approach road with the mountains behind them and the cabin ahead, smoke coming from the chimney in a straight column that told him the wind was calm and the fire had been well maintained by someone who knew what they were doing. Finn saw them from the yard. He went from standing still to full sprint in the span of a breath, crossing the snow in a straight line toward the horses with his coat flapping open behind him, and he hit Silas's boot with both arms before the bay had fully stopped and held on with the grip of a 7-year-old whose primary mode of emotional expression is physical. 5 days, Finn said into Silas's leg. You said 5 days. It was 5.5. Half a day is still more than 5 days. Mathematically accurate. Silas got down from the horse and crouched to Finn's level, and the boy transferred the grip from his leg to his neck and held on for a moment that Silas allowed to be as long as it needed to be. Owen appeared in the cabin doorway. He stood there with his arms crossed in his characteristic posture of managed concern, watching Silas and Finn, and then his eyes went to Eliza still on the gray mare, and some calculation completed itself in his face, and he nodded once, mostly to himself, and came down the steps. The east fence held, he told Silas. Tom Henderson and Wyatt reinforced it on day 2. The bay mare threw a small shoe on the left front, but Wyatt packed it, and she's fine. We ran low on salt, but Mrs. Henderson had extra. I kept a list. Of course you did, Silas said. It's in the kitchen. You should review it. Owen looked at Eliza as she dismounted. Did it work? It worked, she said. The filing is on record. Owen absorbed this with a single nod. Good. He reached out and took the gray mare's reins without being asked. I'll take her. Eliza looked at the boy for a moment. This 10-year-old with his lists and his composed competence and his enormous quiet heart, and said, Thank you, Owen. He shrugged with the studied casualness of a boy who has decided that being thanked properly is embarrassing. She's a good horse, he said, and led the mare toward the barn. Wyatt came from around the side of the barn. He had a hammer in one hand and the particular look of someone interrupted mid-task, and he stopped when he saw them and stood where he was for a moment, reading the situation the way he always did, taking the full picture before speaking. He looked at his father. Everything all right? Everything's handled. Creed? He'll fight it through the courts. It's going to take time. Silas met his son's eyes. But the documents are filed. His foundational claim is challenged on record. That's what matters. Wyatt nodded slowly. Then he looked at Eliza. Something moved across his face. The adjustment of someone revising an internal calculation they've been running for 5 days. You look cold, he said. It was not an apology. It was not a welcome, exactly. But from Wyatt, it was both of those things wearing the only coat he knew how to put them in, and Eliza appeared to understand that. I've been cold for 4 days, she said. Your father's horse is dramatic about creek crossings. He is, Wyatt agreed. He looked at the hammer in his hand, then back up. There's coffee inside. Tom Henderson's wife makes it wrong, but it's hot. He went back around the barn. Silas and Eliza stood in the yard for a moment. That's Wyatt welcoming you, Silas said quietly. I know, she said. I speak the language. Inside, the cabin was fuller than he'd left it. The Henderson family was still there, circumstances being what they were, with a burned house and a January that wasn't offering alternatives. And Ruth Henderson had clearly taken the temporary arrangement and organized it into something functional. The kitchen running on a schedule that included Finn setting the table without being asked, and Owen doing a supply inventory that had been posted on the wall next to the pantry in his small, precise handwriting. Tom Henderson was at the far end of the table working through some paperwork, and he looked up when Silas came in and stood to shake his hand with the directness of a man who has been keeping something in trust and is relieved to return it. Ranch is in good shape, Tom said. Your oldest runs a tighter operation than you'd expect for 13. I'd expect it, Silas said. Ruth's been running the kitchen with Eliza's setup. We've been comfortable. Tom's voice had the careful quality of a man who is aware that comfortable is a word that sits oddly when your house has burned, but is also the most honest word available. We need to talk about what comes next for us. We will, Silas said. Not tonight. Tom nodded. He sat back down. Ruth appeared from the kitchen and looked at Eliza with an expression that moved through relief and into something warmer. The particular warmth of two women who have done hard things in the same space and understand each other through that. Sit down, Ruth said to Eliza. I'll get you something hot. Eliza sat down. She sat with the ease of someone who has, perhaps without fully meaning to, come to know where things are in this kitchen, which chair doesn't wobble, how far from the stove is warm without being too warm. Silas watched her and thought, there it is. That evening, after supper, when the Henderson children were settled and Finn had been deposited in bed by a combination of gravity and exhaustion, and Owen had reviewed his list with Silas in the comprehensive manner of a junior quartermaster completing a handover, and Ruth had done the dishes without discussion, Silas found Wyatt in the barn doing something that didn't strictly need doing at that hour. He sat on the hay bale across from his son and let the silence be itself for a moment. You did well, Silas said. Tom Henderson did most of the physical work. Wyatt didn't look up from the harness he was mending with unnecessary concentration. You kept the ranch running. You looked after your brothers. You were responsible for a family that wasn't yours when your father was gone. Silas looked at him. That's not nothing. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Is she staying? The question landed with its full weight. Silas didn't deflect it. I don't know. I'd like her to. Wyatt's hand stilled on the harness. He looked up. That honest enough? Silas said. Yeah. Wyatt looked at the harness again. She helped Finn when I couldn't after Mama. He said it to the leather, not to his father. He talks to her different than he talks to us. I don't know what she does, but it works. I noticed. And Owen's been darning his own socks since she left. The slightest pause. He's getting better at it. I heard. Wyatt set the harness down. He looked at his father with the expression that showed up when the 13-year-old put down the adult he'd been pretending to be and was just himself for a moment. Is it okay? He asked. That it would be okay if she stayed? It cost him something to ask it, and Silas knew what it cost. He'd asked himself the same question, pointed inward, 100 times in the past week. Whether wanting something new was a betrayal of what had come before. Whether the door you opened to the next thing was the same door you closed on the last. Your mother would have liked her, Silas said. She didn't have much patience for people who perform things instead of just doing them. Eliza does things. Wyatt looked at the hay under his boots. Yeah, he said, she does. And yes, Silas said, it's okay. Wyatt nodded. He picked the harness back up. I'm going to finish this, he said, which meant he was done with the conversation and needed the exit of the task, and Silas understood that and stood up. At the barn door, he stopped. Wyatt. Yeah. Good work. He said it simply, without ornamentation, the way his own father had said it when it was true and meant to land without frills. Wyatt's jaw moved slightly. Thanks, Papa, he said, and kept his eyes on the harness, and Silas went back to the cabin. Eliza was sitting by the fire with the wooden chest on the table beside her. Not open, just there. She had a cup of something warm and she was looking at the fire the way people look at fires when they're not thinking about the fire. He sat down across from her. What are you thinking about? He asked. Clara, she said. She said it the way she said her daughter's name now, not with the braced quality of the first time, on the porch steps in the cold, but with the steady directness of someone who has decided that the name belongs in the air rather than locked away. She would have been 5 in March. She would have wanted a cake with something specific on it. She was always specific. Like a sailor bear. She almost smiled. Exactly like that. He looked at the chest. What will you do with the documents now? Copies are with Webb. I'll keep these. Evidence until the case is resolved. She touched the lid. And the rest? The photographs? Daniel's letters? Those are just mine. That doesn't change. No. She looked at him. I've been thinking about what you said at the way station. He waited. I'm not capable of pretending to be further along than I am, she said. I want you to know I understand that about myself. I've tried to outrun things before. I know how that ends. I'm not asking you to outrun anything. I know. She looked at the fire. But I also know that what I said about wanting to be somewhere that stays, that was true when I said it. It's still true. She looked at him. This place feels like it stays. He held her gaze. It does. Your boys feel like they stay. They do. They're also loud and difficult, and Owen will explain the correct way to do things you've been doing for 20 years. And Finn will lose everything he touches, and Wyatt will watch you for another 6 months before he completely lets his guard down. I know. She looked at the fire. None of that frightens me. What does? She was quiet for a moment. Being needed for a while and then not. She said it plainly, without self-pity, just the fact of it. That's the shape of what I'm afraid of. I understand that, he said. I've been afraid of the same thing in the other direction, needing something and losing it. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. I don't have a way to guarantee against that. Nobody does. The frontier doesn't, time doesn't, nothing does. He looked at her. What I can tell you is that I'm not a man who does things part way. When I'm in, I'm in. That's not always a comfortable trait. No, she said. But it's a useful one. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind moved across the roof in a long, slow sound and then went still. Stay through January, he said. That's all. Just stay through January and we'll see where things are. She looked at him for a long moment. And February? February we can discuss in February. She looked at the chest, at the fire, at her hands in her lap, the cracked knuckles, the evidence of everything they'd done in the past 2 weeks. All right, she said. It was the 3rd time she'd said it to him. He noticed, and he thought about what each one had meant, and he thought that this one meant the most. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. They were something more ordinary and more durable than a transformation. They were the accumulation of days that are almost identical and therefore easy to underestimate. Eliza stayed through January. In January, they did not discuss February because February arrived before they thought to, with its own work and its own demands, and she was in the kitchen when it got there and she stayed through it. The Henderson family found a temporary solution through the church in town, a rental arrangement for a small house until spring allowed for rebuilding. And Tom left with the particular mix of relief and obligation that marks a person who has been helped more than they expected and intends to spend the rest of their life being useful in return. He was back the following week to help Silas run new fence wire on the east pasture, and the week after that. It became a pattern. Marcus Webb sent a letter in February and another in March. The territorial court in Cheyenne had accepted the filing. Creed had engaged 2 attorneys of his own. It would be a long process. But the survey evidence was clear, and Jedediah Cole had been located in Oregon and had provided a formal deposition confirming the contents of the signed statement. The case was moving. Creed sent no more riders to the Boone property line. Whether this was calculation or a temporary tactical retreat, neither Silas nor Eliza pretended to know. They watched for it without making the watching the center of their lives, which is the only way to be vigilant without being consumed by it. Finn asked Eliza in February if she would tell the story about the sailor bear. He asked it at supper, with his characteristic lack of preamble, setting the request on the table between the cornbread and the beans like an item that needed to be discussed. "You told me Clara liked a story about a bear who wanted to be a sailor. I want to hear it." The table went quiet. Owen looked at his plate. Wyatt looked at Finn with the expression of an older brother calculating whether this required intervention. Eliza looked at Finn for a moment. "I made it up as I went," she said. "I don't remember all of it." "That's fine," Finn said. "I make up the good parts when Papa tells stories too." Silas said nothing, on the grounds that this was probably true. That night, Eliza sat on the edge of Finn's bed and told a story about a bear named Samuel who was determined to be a sailor despite having paws that were poorly suited for rope work, and who eventually found that his real skill was not sailing but navigation, because bears have an excellent sense of direction and the sea doesn't care what you look like as long as you know where you're going. Finn was asleep before Samuel reached his first port. Eliza sat with the finished story for a moment in the dark room, and then she got up and went back to the main room. She told Silas about it later. He listened and didn't say anything particularly useful, and she didn't need him to. Spring arrived. The Way, Wyoming. Spring arrives, not gracefully, not all at once, but in installments, each one taking back a little of the cold and grudgingly leaving a little more warmth in its place. The snow came off the pastures in patches, revealing the grass underneath, brown and flat, and already starting to consider the possibility of growing again. The cattle found it immediately and applied themselves to it with the focused enthusiasm of animals who have been on winter feed for 4 months and have opinions about variety. Webb's letter in April was the significant one. The territorial court had ruled on the foundational question. The survey records predating Creed's claim were valid. The claim itself had been improperly filed, and the entirety of Creed's expansion built on that filing was subject to review. It was not a complete resolution. There were appeals available to Creed, and he would certainly use them. But the ruling meant that every acquisition he'd made using the fraudulent foundation was now legally uncertain, and uncertainty of that kind does specific things to a man's operation. Banks adjust their terms. Partners reconsider their arrangements. The people who have been accommodating Creed's version of reality because it seemed solid start quietly looking for firmer ground. Eliza read the letter at the kitchen table on an April morning with Owen beside her doing something with figures on a piece of paper and Finn coming in and out of the door with the selective awareness of a child who has things to do outside and finds indoors interesting only in short intervals. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment. "Good news?" Owen asked, without looking up from his figures. "Good news," she said. Owen nodded and kept working. Finn appeared in the doorway. "What kind of good news?" "The legal kind." Finn considered this. "Is that better or worse than the regular kind?" "Different," Eliza said. He went back outside. She brought the letter to Silas in the barn, where he was evaluating the spring condition of the cattle with the systematic attention of a man who has been doing this for 20 years and still does not rush it. She handed him the letter without preamble and watched his face as he read. He read it through, folded it, handed it back. "It's not over," he said. "No, but it's different now." She put the letter in her coat pocket. "Creed is fighting on defense instead of offense. That matters." "It does." He looked at the cattle, then at her. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I expected to feel more." She looked at her hands. Better now than they'd been in January, the cold having come out of them with the season. Like maybe the feeling is slower than the fact. That's usually how it works. When does it catch up? I don't know. I don't think there's a schedule. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then because she had decided over the winter that honesty was the only foundation worth building on. I'm sad. Still, both things are true. Both things can be true, he said. Yes. She looked at the cattle, at the spring pasture beyond them, at the mountains that had been there through all of it and would be there through all of what came next. Daniel would have wanted to see this resolved. He cared about fairness the way some people care about air. He couldn't breathe without it. She paused. I keep wanting to tell him. I know that feeling. Do you still have it with Margaret? Sometimes, when something happens with the boys that she would have. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I told her about you, actually. Not out loud. Just the way you do. In your head. She looked at him. What did you tell her? That she would have liked your work ethic and been irritated by your self-sufficiency because it left her with less to help with. He paused. I told her that whatever happens, I'm glad I opened the door. Eliza looked at the mountain and felt the thing that had been slower than the facts begin, quietly and without announcement, to arrive. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like the particular feeling of standing on solid ground after a long time of walking on uncertain terrain, when your body finally trusts the surface and lets itself relax in a way it didn't know it had been withholding. I'm glad you opened it too, she said. They stood in the barn together in the April morning while outside the mud of the yard showed through the snow in expanding patches, and somewhere in the pasture the cattle moved through the new season with their long-established indifference to human drama, and the mountains did what mountains do, which is to say they remained, and the ranch did what the ranch had always done under Silas's hands and Margaret's memory, and now something new that didn't yet have a name but was taking shape in the ordinary business of days. In June, Silas placed the wooden chest on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. He did it in the morning before the boys were up, carefully, with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. Eliza came downstairs and saw it, and stopped in the middle of the room. It shouldn't stay in a pack, he said. It's not a traveling thing anymore. She looked at it for a long time. The dark walnut, the iron hinges, the evidence of handling and distance and months of being the most important thing in the room. On the mantelpiece it looked different, settled, like something that had found the place it was supposed to be. All right, she said. It was the fourth time. He counted privately, because the progression of it mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. From, I just need an hour to I'll take the spare room to let's go to Caldwell Station to this, to the chest on the mantel and the spring light coming through the window and the sound of Finn's feet on the stairs above them, approaching with his customary lack of subtlety. Finn appeared on the landing, looked at the chest on the mantel, and said, Did we always have that there? No, Silas said. It looks good there, Finn said, with the authority of a 7-year-old who has strong aesthetic opinions and no uncertainty about expressing them, and went to find his boots. Wyatt came down behind him. He saw the chest. He looked at his father. He looked at Eliza. Some final calculation completed itself behind his eyes, the long one he'd been running since Christmas Eve, and he said nothing, because he was Wyatt, and saying nothing was frequently his most complete form of acceptance. But at breakfast he passed the biscuits to Eliza before she'd asked for them, which was the kind of thing that doesn't mean much unless you know the person doing it, and then it means a great deal. What Silas understood, sitting at that table on an ordinary June morning with the windows open and the smell of the pasture coming in, and his 3 sons eating with the focused attention of boys who are hungry and have no particular agenda other than being fed, was something that he had resisted understanding for 3 years because it required him to hold 2 true things at once. The first true thing was that what he'd had with Margaret was real and worth every year of grief that followed losing it. The second true thing was that the grief was not a monument you were supposed to build your house around. It was the evidence of something real. It pointed backward, toward what you'd loved. But you were still here, pointing forward, and the question was what you did with the direction. He had opened a door on Christmas Eve because a woman was freezing in a storm, and there was no other decent option. He had ridden south because justice was possible, and someone needed to be willing to help carry it across a ridge. He had stood on a boarding house porch in Caldwell Station and told a man with 4 armed riders behind him that his sons' names were not available for use as leverage. None of those things had been grand gestures. They had been the ordinary choices of a person trying to do the right thing in the specific situation in front of him. The accumulation of those choices, stacked one on top of the other over the course of a December blizzard and 3 hard riding days and a slow spring of learning to trust the ground again, had made something that the man sitting at the June breakfast table was not entirely sure he deserved, but was choosing, with full awareness of the choice, to accept. The chest sat on the mantel. Inside it, Daniel Rowan and Clara Rowan remained exactly what they had always been: real, loved, irreplaceable, and past. That didn't diminish them. It just meant that the present was also real, also worth something, also deserving of the full weight of a person's attention. Eliza passed Finn another biscuit, and he received it with the uncomplicated gratitude of a child who does not yet know that gratitude is something some people learn to make complicated. Owen finished his figures and folded them and put them in his pocket for later. Wyatt ate and said nothing and was, in his silence, entirely present. The mountains sat where they had always sat, and the ranch turned toward summer, and outside in the pasture the cattle moved through the new grass with the long, slow patience of animals that have learned to trust the season. And the wooden chest stayed where Silas had put it, and none of them had any way of knowing what the next year would bring, which is the only way it ever is, and they were there anyway, which is the only answer anyone has ever really had to that. There is a thing that happens when you open a door in the middle of a storm. You let the cold in, yes, but cold was already everywhere. What you're really doing is making a choice about what you're willing to let reach you. Most people don't realize that's what they're doing in the moment. They think they're just being decent. They think they're just making a practical decision about weather and survival and the limits of what can be asked of a person in a blizzard. But the door is never just a door. The stranger is never only a stranger. And what you find, if you're lucky and if you stay, is that the thing you let in when you opened up against the cold was not only another person's need. It was the possibility of your own.